Hello there. Tonight we explore 20 mysteries that sit right at the edge of what science has been able to explain. Events that were witnessed, documented, measured, and in some cases studied for decades without producing a complete answer. These are not legends or folklore. They are real occurrences with real physical evidence, and the people who investigated them were serious researchers who simply could not close the case. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. The visuals are there for enjoyment, but not necessary. This is meant to be heard in the background while you rest, while you study, while you drift off. Now let's begin. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a prosperous trading town on the Rhine, in what is now northeastern France, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, there was no occasion. She simply began moving, and she did not stop. For 6 days, Frau Troffea danced in the street in front of her house, barely pausing to sleep or eat, her feet bleeding from the cobblestones, her body visibly exhausted but unable or unwilling to rest. Her husband attempted to bring her inside. She returned to the street. Neighbors watched from doorways. The clergy were summoned. No one could explain it. Within a week, she had been joined by 30 or so others. Within a month, the number had grown to somewhere between 400 and 1,000 people, depending on which historical account you read. All of them dancing, all of them unable or unwilling to stop. All of them in apparent states of desperate physical distress that coexisted with the continuous movement in ways that made it impossible to tell whether they were choosing to dance or were compelled by something none of the observers could identify. Contemporary physicians examined the afflicted and concluded that the cause was overheated blood. Their recommended treatment was more dancing, on the theory that the affliction needed to run its course. The city council hired professional musicians to accompany the dancers, believing that keeping the rhythm organized and controlled would hasten the end of the episode. A platform was constructed. Guild halls were opened as dancing spaces. The event was treated as a public health crisis requiring management rather than suppression. At its peak, witnesses reported that people were dancing themselves to death. Historical records mention deaths from heart attacks, strokes, and exhaustion. This is the specific detail that makes the dancing plague of 1518 impossible to dismiss as simple hysteria in the dismissive sense. People were physically dying from it. Whatever was happening was not merely psychological in the sense of being imaginary. It had physical consequences so severe that the death toll, while impossible to verify precisely from the surviving records, was not zero. The episode lasted roughly 2 months before gradually subsiding. The dancers were eventually taken to a shrine in Saverne, where prayers and rituals appeared to produce some relief. Then it was over. The dancing stopped. Normal life in Strasbourg resumed. The event was documented by the city council in official records that survive today, making it one of the best documented episodes of mass behavior in medieval history. And despite this documentation, despite the records of the city council and the accounts of physicians and the testimony of witnesses, the dancing plague of 1518 has never been satisfactorily explained. The dominant modern interpretation, mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, proposes that the dancing was a stress response in a population under extreme pressure. Strasbourg in 1518 was experiencing famine, disease, and the social anxiety of a community in economic and spiritual crisis. In this interpretation, the dancing was a kind of collective psychological break, a release of unbearable tension in the form of compulsive movement that spread from person to person through the mechanisms of social contagion that we know are real and well documented in other contexts. Mass psychogenic illness has been recorded in many times and places, in schools where outbreaks of fainting or nausea spread rapidly through student populations, in factories where unexplained symptoms appear in clusters, in communities exposed to shared stressors who develop shared physical symptoms. But the mass psychogenic illness explanation, while compelling in its broad outlines, cannot fully account for all the specific features of the 1518 episode. The duration of the dancing, not minutes or hours, but days and weeks, exceeds what documented psychogenic illnesses typically produce. The apparent inability of the dancers to stop, even when clearly exhausted and in pain, is more extreme than the symptomatic profiles of most documented psychogenic events. And the deaths, if the contemporary accounts of fatalities are accurate, represent an outcome severity that has not been replicated in any well-documented modern case of mass psychogenic illness. Other explanations have been proposed. Ergot poisoning, contamination of grain supplies by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which produces alkaloids related to LSD, has been suggested as a cause of involuntary convulsive movement in multiple historical epidemics. But the specific symptoms of ergotism typically include constriction of blood vessels, burning sensations in the limbs, and gangrene rather than the coordinated, sustained dancing described in Strasbourg. A specific religious context has also been proposed. Strasbourg at this period had a particular cult devoted to Saint Vitus, whose intercession was sought for nervous disorders, and the dancing may have had a specifically ritual or ecstatic religious dimension that made it culturally intelligible in ways that encouraged participation and discouraged stopping. In this interpretation, the dancing was partly voluntary and partly coercive in the social sense. People who had begun dancing could not stop without violating the specific cultural frame of the episode. None of these explanations is complete. 500 years later, with all the tools of modern neuroscience, epidemiology, and social psychology available, the dancing plague of 1518 remains a genuine mystery. An event that happened, that was documented, that killed people, and that cannot be fully explained by any available framework. It is the kind of mystery that reveals how much we still do not understand about the relationship between the social and the physical, between what happens in a community's shared imagination and what happens in the bodies of the people who make up that community. The bodies matter. The blood on Frau Troffea's feet matters. The deaths matter. The mystery is not imaginary, and neither, whatever its cause, was the dancing. 500 years and several thousand miles from the cobblestones of Strasbourg, in the shallow tropical waters of the Bahamas, there are holes in the ocean floor that open into a world so alien in its chemistry that it has been compared to conditions on other planets. They are called blue holes, circular, near-vertical shafts dropping through the limestone bedrock of the Bahamian Shelf into darkness below. Some of them descend hundreds of meters. Some of them are connected to extensive horizontal cave systems that spread for miles through the surrounding rock. And in their depths, at specific layers where chemistry changes dramatically, researchers have found things that were not supposed to be there. The most scientifically significant feature of the Bahamian blue holes is a specific layer found at certain depths called the chemocline. Above the chemocline, the water is oxygenated, it connects to the ocean, and marine life of various kinds moves through it. Below the chemocline, the water is anoxic, essentially without oxygen. The chemocline itself is a sharp boundary, sometimes only a few centimeters thick, across which the water chemistry changes dramatically. Below it, hydrogen sulfide builds up in concentrations that would be lethal to most forms of life. The temperature and salinity change, and the darkness below is not simply the darkness of depth, but the darkness of an environment essentially disconnected from the surface world. In this anoxic darkness, researchers diving in the blue holes of the Bahamas have found things that have required significant reconsideration of what we thought we knew about the history of the region. One of the most significant discoveries was made in Sawmill Sink on Abaco Island, where divers found the bones of animals lying in the anoxic layers at the bottom of the hole in a state of extraordinary preservation. The absence of oxygen had prevented the bacterial decomposition that normally destroys organic material on the seafloor, and the result was a collection of bones from animals that had lived on what is now the seafloor of the Bahamas during the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough that the current ocean floor was dry land or shallow coastal territory. The bones included species of tortoise and bird and other animals not currently found in the Bahamas, providing a window into an ecosystem that existed here 10 to 15,000 years ago that would not otherwise have survived at all. But the more unsettling discoveries in the Bahamian blue holes involve the living occupants of the anoxic layers. the life that somehow exists in an environment hostile to almost everything we understand about biology. Microbial mats, communities of microorganisms, thrive in the chemocline and below it, using chemical gradients rather than light and oxygen for their energy, in a metabolic mode called chemolithotrophy that is thought to resemble the conditions under which life may have first originated on Earth. These microbial communities are not merely surviving in an extreme environment, they are ecologically elaborate, organized into stratified communities that exploit different chemical gradients at different depths, with diversity and complexity that has surprised the researchers who have studied them. The blue holes also periodically produce a phenomenon that is locally well known and scientifically not fully understood. At certain states of the tide, the flow of water through the opening and the cave systems below can reverse dramatically, creating strong outward currents that locals describe as the blue hole's breathing. Large amounts of water surge in and then surge out again with the tidal cycle, and the specific hydraulics of individual holes can produce currents and flow patterns that differ significantly from hole to hole, apparently as a function of the geometry of the cave systems below. The full extent of those cave systems, where they go, what they connect to, how large they are, has not been mapped. The divers who enter them do so at considerable risk, and many of the most significant caves below the accessible entry shafts remain unexplored. The Bahamian blue holes are, in this sense, simultaneously, some of the most studied and most unknown environments in the ocean. The surface layer examined in detail, the depths still largely unknown, the cave systems extending through the rock in directions that no instrument has fully charted. What the blue holes suggest in their quiet way is that the ocean floor is not an empty landscape. It is an archive, a living system, and in places a record of environmental history so precise and so complete that it transforms the geography of the ocean into a kind of documentary evidence about the deep past of the planet. The bones in the anoxic layers were lying there throughout the entire span of recorded human history, perfectly preserved, while civilizations rose and fell on the surface above them. They were waiting, in the dark and the silence, for someone to arrive with a diving apparatus and a light and enough time to look carefully at what had been left behind. Leaving the depths of the ocean and traveling to the interior of a Norwegian valley, we encounter a phenomenon that has been documented, measured, photographed, and filmed continuously for more than 40 years without producing a definitive explanation. The Hessdalen Valley in central Norway is a remote and sparsely populated region of the Scandinavian mountains, approximately 120 kilometers south of Trondheim, accessible by a single road that follows the valley floor between steep forested slopes. There is nothing obvious about the geography or geology that should make it remarkable, and yet for decades the valley has been producing lights. The Hessdalen lights, as they have come to be called, are anomalous atmospheric light phenomena observed repeatedly by residents and researchers in and around the Hessdalen Valley. They take a variety of forms. Some appear as stationary glowing spheres, white or yellow or red in color, hovering at low altitude above the valley floor or the surrounding ridgelines. Some move slowly across the sky. Some move rapidly, changing direction in ways that eliminate the possibility of conventional aircraft. Some appear to flash or strobe. Some have been observed to divide into multiple separate objects. Some appear at ground level. Some have been observed in daylight, but are most frequently reported at night. The phenomenon is not rare or anecdotal. During a particularly active period in the early 1980s, local residents were reporting sightings at a rate of up to 20 per week. A systematic scientific observation program called Project Hessdalen was established in 1983 and has maintained instrumented monitoring of the valley continuously since that time. The data collected over 4 decades includes thousands of individual observations documented with radar, infrared sensors, spectrum analyzers, magnetometers, and video cameras. The lights are real. They appear on multiple instruments simultaneously. They register on radar in ways consistent with physical objects rather than optical illusions. They produce measurable electromagnetic emissions, and their cause remains the subject of active scientific debate. The most widely discussed scientific explanation proposes that the lights are a form of plasma, ionized gas, generated by natural processes involving the specific geology and atmospheric chemistry of the valley. The Hessdalen Valley is underlain by a contact zone between different rock types, including sulfurous rocks that, in combination with the specific climate and hydrology of the valley, might generate conditions favorable for the production of piezoelectric effects, electrical charges generated by mechanical stress on certain crystal structures, that could in turn produce ionized gas capable of self-sustaining luminosity. This plasma hypothesis is supported by spectroscopic observations that have identified specific emission lines in the light produced by the Hessdalen phenomenon, consistent with plasma emission rather than simple thermal radiation. But the plasma hypothesis does not account for all observed behaviors. The structured shapes of some of the lights, the spherical geometry, the division into multiple separate objects exceed what simple plasma columns or balls would be expected to produce. The radar returns are sometimes inconsistent with a diffuse plasma cloud and more consistent with a solid or dense object of specific dimensions. The longevity of some of the phenomena, some individual displays have lasted for hours rather than the seconds that plasma phenomena typically persist, requires an explanation for how the energy sustaining the luminosity is maintained over such extended periods. Researchers associated with Project Hessdalen have continued refining their understanding of the phenomenon, and newer instrumentation has added detail to the observational picture that simpler early instruments could not provide. The lights appear more frequently during specific atmospheric conditions, suggesting a meteorological component to the triggering mechanism. They are more common in certain locations in the valley than others, consistent with the geological heterogeneity of the underlying rock. Statistical analysis of the observation data has revealed patterns in the timing and frequency of the lights that suggest they are driven by natural processes rather than by random or arbitrary factors. But a complete, accepted scientific explanation, one that accounts for all the observed behaviors and has been confirmed by specific experimental tests, has not yet been produced. The Hessdalen lights remain a real, measured, well-documented phenomenon in search of a complete, mechanistic explanation. They have been observed by thousands of people over 40 years, studied by scientists with modern instrumentation, and written about in peer-reviewed journals. And they are still there in the valley, appearing and disappearing in the Norwegian nights, waiting for the understanding that has not quite arrived. From a valley in Norway that produces lights no one can fully explain, we travel to a high desert plateau in New Mexico, where a sound no one can fully explain has been bothering a small fraction of the population for decades. The Taos hum is a persistent, low-frequency sound heard by approximately 2% of the people who live in and around the town of Taos, New Mexico, and not heard by the other 98%. Those who hear it describe it consistently. A low, steady, diesel engine-like drone somewhere in the frequency range of 30 to 80 Hz, audible both inside and outside of buildings, not obviously localized to any direction, persistent through day and night and across all seasons. It does not stop. It is not produced by identifiable local industrial activity. It cannot be blocked by standard acoustic insulation, and it is not detected by the sensitive microphones that researchers have deployed in attempts to record it. That last detail is crucial and strange. If a sound is loud enough to be heard by human ears in normal conditions, it should be loud enough to be recorded by a sensitive microphone. The fact that the Taos hum appears to be audible to the people who hear it but undetectable by instruments suggests either that the people who report hearing it are experiencing something other than airborne sound waves, that the perception is generated by some other mechanism, or that the instruments deployed have not been the right kind or have not been deployed in the right way to detect the specific signal that the hearers are perceiving. Research into the Taos hum was formally conducted in the 1990s, when a team of researchers from several universities and institutions was commissioned by Congress to investigate after residents' complaints became sufficiently numerous and persistent to attract political attention. The researchers conducted a comprehensive survey of Taos residents, documented the descriptions of hearers, deployed acoustic monitoring equipment, and investigated potential local industrial sources including natural gas pipelines, military operations at nearby facilities, and industrial activity in the region. Their published report concluded that the hum was real in the sense that the people who reported it were experiencing a genuine perceptual phenomenon. They were not making it up, not imagining it, not experiencing ordinary tinnitus. But the report could not identify the source. Low-frequency noise at the frequencies described, below about 80 Hz, has specific properties that make it both difficult to localize and difficult to block. Low-frequency sound waves have long wavelengths that pass easily through walls and insulation that effectively block higher-frequency sounds. They propagate over long distances with relatively little attenuation. They can be generated by industrial processes, natural geological activity, ocean waves, atmospheric processes, and a range of other sources at distances of hundreds of kilometers, and still be detectable at a specific location if the geometry and terrain are right. The inability to localize the Tao's hum or identify its source does not mean the source does not exist. It may mean that the source is distant, diffuse, or involves a combination of factors that makes identification through standard acoustic investigation techniques difficult. A different class of explanation focuses on the perception rather than the sound. Some researchers have proposed that the Tao's hum might be perceived by the approximately 2% of hearers not as an airborne sound wave, but as a direct mechanical stimulation of the inner ear, or the body's tissues, by seismic vibrations, electromagnetic fields, or other physical signals that are not detected by standard microphones, but that are capable of producing the perception of sound in some individuals. This hypothesis would explain the inability of instruments to record the sound that hearers report. It would also explain why only some people hear it. Differences in individual physiology, particularly in the sensitivity of the inner ear or in the mechanical resonance properties of specific anatomical structures, might make some people susceptible to perceiving a signal that most people cannot detect. A related phenomenon, the perception of low-frequency sound by individuals that is inaudible to others and undetectable by instruments, has been documented at multiple locations around the world, including in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and in various other parts of the United States. The global character of the phenomenon and the consistency of descriptions across different geographic locations and different hearers suggests that whatever is causing it is not specific to Taos or to New Mexico. Some widespread physical phenomenon may be producing low-frequency signals that interact with the sensory apparatus of a subset of people in a way that creates the perception of a persistent, inexplicable drone. What that something is remains, despite decades of investigation, genuinely unknown. The Dyatlov Pass sits at an elevation of about 1,100 meters in the northern Ural Mountains, on the border between European Russia and Siberia, in a region of exposed ridgeline above the treeline where winter storms produce conditions among the most hostile in the mountain range. On the night of January 31st to February 1st, 1959, 9 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute made camp on the eastern slope of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl, the Mountain of the Dead. In the hours that followed, all 9 of them died. What killed them has been debated for more than 60 years. The physical evidence recovered when search parties found the camp in February 1959 is both extensive and deeply contradictory. The tent was found on the slope, intact, but cut open from the inside. Someone had slashed through the fabric with a knife from within, in cuts consistent with people making a rapid exit in conditions where opening the tent zipper was somehow not possible or not quick enough. The hikers' footprints led away from the tent and down the slope toward the tree line, approximately 1.5 kilometers below the camp. Crucially, the footprints were those of people in their socks or wearing only a single layer of clothing, not dressed for the temperature outside, which was well below -20 Celsius. They had left the tent without their winter gear. 5 of the 9 bodies were found near the tree line. 2 of them had climbed a large cedar tree, breaking branches on the way up, branches that were found with skin and blood on them, suggesting they had been trying to see something or escape something. The other 3 were found in the vicinity of an improvised fire pit, in positions suggesting they had been sitting near a small fire when they died. Branches of the cedar had been broken off at the level of a tall man, apparently for firewood. All 5 of these bodies showed evidence of death from hypothermia. The 4 remaining hikers were found months later, buried under several meters of snow in a ravine further from the camp. 3 of the 4 showed evidence of catastrophic internal injuries, fractured ribs, a fractured skull, without corresponding external trauma to the skin. 1 was missing her tongue. The absence of external trauma corresponding to the internal injuries is the specific detail that has most resisted explanation. The force required to fracture ribs in the way observed, multiple ribs fractured in a specific pattern, is comparable to the force of a car crash or a fall from significant height, but the skin of the affected individuals showed no cuts or bruises consistent with that level of external impact. Soviet investigators who examined the bodies noted that the internal injuries resembled those produced by a pressure wave, an explosion, or a powerful atmospheric event, rather than by a blow from a blunt object. The missing tongue adds a further detail that has never been adequately explained. For decades, the case was officially closed as death by an unknown compelling natural force, a verdict that satisfied no one because it explained nothing. Theories accumulated: an avalanche, a military weapons test, infrasound from the terrain causing panic, an attack by the local Mansi people, classified Soviet military activity in the area, and, inevitably, a UFO. None of these explanations accounts for the full body of evidence. The avalanche theory was the most scientifically respectable but the most difficult to reconcile with specific features of the scene. The slope angle at the tent's location was not steep enough to produce a significant avalanche by standard meteorological models, and the experienced hikers who had been trained in mountain survival had chosen the site specifically, apparently assessing it as safe. In 2021, a new investigation by Russian authorities specifically examined the avalanche hypothesis using modern snow modeling software. The investigators proposed a rare type of slab avalanche triggered by the interaction of wind-deposited snow with the specific slope geometry, producing a delayed release that could have struck the tent hours after the hikers settled in. The force of such an avalanche, they argued, could account for the internal injuries without producing corresponding external trauma if the impact were transmitted through snow rather than direct contact. The tongue, they proposed, could have been removed by scavenging after decomposition. The 2021 investigation was widely reported as having solved the Dyatlov Pass mystery. But the researchers working on the case, and many of the scientists and investigators who have studied it for decades, do not share this view. The specific snow conditions required for the proposed avalanche are unusual enough at the location that the probability of the event remains debated. The injury patterns in the specific victims showing the most severe trauma are not entirely consistent with the proposed mechanism, and the behavior of the hikers, specifically the evidence that they cut through the tent from the inside, descended 1.5 kilometers of slope without proper clothing in severe cold, and apparently divided into groups rather than staying together, is not fully explained by an avalanche that occurred while they were asleep. People woken from sleep by an avalanche do not typically cut through their tent and then walk calmly down the slope. They tend to stay with the tent or attempt to dig out. The Dyatlov Pass incident is the kind of mystery that becomes more, rather than less, resistant to explanation the more carefully the evidence is examined. Every proposed solution accounts for some of the evidence and not for other parts of it. Every new analysis that appears to close the case reopens it from a different direction. 9 experienced hikers died on a mountain in the northern Urals in the winter of 1959, and the specific sequence of events that produced their deaths in the specific distribution and condition in which their bodies were found has not been established to the satisfaction of the researchers who know the evidence best. 12 years before the Dyatlov Pass incident, and more than 6,000 kilometers to the east, an event of an entirely different scale occurred in a remote region of Siberia that required not individual investigators but the coordinated attention of the entire scientific establishment of a major world power to begin to comprehend. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, at approximately 7:15 in the morning local time, something detonated in the atmosphere above the Podkamennaya Tunguska River basin in central Siberia. The explosion was heard and felt over an area of approximately 2 million square kilometers, an area larger than Western Europe. People at a distance of 60 kilometers from the epicenter were knocked off their feet. Windows were shattered at distances of hundreds of kilometers. A seismic shock was recorded by instruments around the world. The atmospheric pressure wave produced by the explosion circled the Earth twice, detectable on barographs in England, Washington, and elsewhere. Eyewitness accounts from people as far as 600 kilometers away described seeing a column of bluish light as bright as the sun moving across the sky, followed by a flash and a series of detonations that shook the ground and threw people from their horses. When the first scientific expedition reached the area, delayed by the remoteness of the location and by the disruptions of the Russian Revolution, so that the first systematic investigation did not occur until 1927, nearly 2 decades after the event, the investigators found something strange. The forest was flattened. Over an area of approximately 2,000 square kilometers, the trees lay with their tops pointed away from the epicenter of the blast, the pattern of a radial pressure wave from above. The scale of destruction was consistent with an explosion many times more powerful than the largest conventional weapon ever used, but there was no crater. No fragments of whatever had produced the explosion were initially found. The ground at the epicenter showed damage consistent with a powerful downward blast, but no impact point of the kind produced by a solid object striking the Earth. This absence, the absence of a crater, of a meteorite, of any solid impacting body, is what has generated the persistent controversy around the Tunguska event. The most widely accepted current explanation is that the explosion was an airburst, the atmospheric detonation of a rocky asteroid or a comet fragment that entered the atmosphere at high speed, was compressed and heated by aerodynamic forces and exploded before reaching the ground. At high altitudes, the airburst of a sufficiently large and/or fragile object can release energy comparable to a nuclear weapon without producing any significant physical remnant at the surface, because the object is essentially vaporized in the explosion. The specific energy of the Tunguska event has been estimated at somewhere between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT equivalent, roughly 1,000 times the energy of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Modern scientific work, including expeditions that have analyzed soil and peat samples from the Tunguska region for chemical signatures of extraterrestrial material, and computer modeling of the fireball trajectory and the pattern of tree fall, has generally supported the asteroid airburst hypothesis. Small quantities of material consistent with a stony asteroid have been found in the peat layers corresponding to the 1908 event. The specific trajectory, energy release, and damage pattern are consistent with an object entering the atmosphere at a shallow angle and detonating at an altitude of approximately 5 to 10 kilometers. But the asteroid airburst explanation, while now the consensus view among planetary scientists, has not fully closed the question. The specific composition of the impacting body, whether it was a rocky asteroid, an icy comet, or some combination, is not established because the material evidence is so sparse that definitive compositional analysis has not been possible. The shallow angle trajectory that best accounts for the damage pattern is less consistent with the typical orbital characteristics of near-Earth asteroids than with cometary material, which has kept the comet hypothesis alive in some scientific discussions. And the Tunguska event itself served as the wake-up call for what became the field of planetary defense, the systematic tracking and mitigation of near-Earth objects capable of causing regional or global catastrophe, precisely because it demonstrated that an object capable of destroying an area the size of a major metropolitan region could arrive without warning and leave behind almost no physical evidence of what it was. The last true survey of what the Tunguska object actually was has not been completed. The area is remote, the physical evidence is sparse, and the questions that remain, what specifically entered the atmosphere on June 30, 1908, where it came from, and exactly how it detonated, are questions that the available evidence cannot fully answer. The absence of a crater is the absence of the most important physical evidence. Without it, the Tunguska event is understood in outline but not in detail, explained plausibly but not definitively. The Tunguska explosion released its energy in the atmosphere rather than the ocean, which is where the next mystery originates. Specifically from a region of the Pacific Ocean approximately 2,000 kilometers south of Easter Island, where in 1997 the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Autonomous Hydrophone Array recorded something unprecedented. The NOAA operates a network of sensitive underwater microphones originally developed during the Cold War to track Soviet submarines that can detect underwater sounds across enormous distances. In August of 1997, this network recorded a sound of extraordinary amplitude and unusual character that analysts nicknamed the bloop. The bloop lasted for approximately 1 minute. It was detected on multiple hydrophones separated by thousands of kilometers, which established that it was a genuine acoustic event of very large scale rather than a localized noise artifact. The sound was extremely low in frequency, too low for human ears to hear directly, and had a characteristic rising profile that gave it its informal name. The amplitude was sufficient to be detected across the breadth of the Pacific Ocean, implying a source of enormous acoustic power. For several years after the detection, the bloop was one of the most discussed unexplained sounds in the scientific literature. The analysts who examined it noted that the acoustic profile, the specific way the sound rose and fell, its frequency components, its temporal structure, was unlike the profile of any known geological or oceanographic event. It was not consistent with submarine volcanic activity, which produces sounds with different spectral characteristics. It was not consistent with an earthquake, which produces different frequency distributions. It was not consistent with the sounds of any known marine animal. The profile was, in some respects, suggestive of a biological source. It had characteristics reminiscent of whale calls, but at a scale several orders of magnitude larger than any whale could produce. This led to some popular speculation about extremely large, unknown deep-sea organisms, which is the version of the story that most people remember. In 2012, NOAA scientists published an analysis suggesting that the bloop was most likely the sound of a large ice quake, the cracking and carving of an iceberg in the Antarctic waters in the direction from which the sound appeared to originate. Ice cracking produces sounds with some acoustic similarities to the bloop's profile, and the specific mechanisms of large-scale ice fracture can generate sounds of sufficient amplitude to propagate across ocean basins. The icequake hypothesis became the widely reported explanation for the bloop, and the story of the mystery ocean sound was generally presented as having been solved. But the icequake hypothesis is not universally accepted among acoustic oceanographers, and the specific match between the bloop's acoustic profile and the profiles of known icequakes is imperfect in ways that leave some researchers unsatisfied. The precise location of the source has not been established with the confidence that a definitive explanation would require, and the broader context of unexplained sounds recorded by the NOAA hydrophone network. The bloop was one of several anomalous sounds recorded in the 1990s, including sounds nicknamed Julia, slow down, train, whistle, and others, each with its own distinctive profile, suggests that the deep ocean is acoustically more complex and more productive of unusual signals than the oceanographic community fully anticipated. The ocean is, in its way, the least explored environment on Earth. Less of the ocean floor has been mapped at high resolution than the surface of Mars or the Moon. The deep ocean environment, below the depth range accessible to conventional diving, in regions where pressure, darkness, and distance make even robotic exploration expensive and difficult, remains substantially unknown. The sounds that the NOAA hydrophone network has detected over the decades represent the acoustic emissions of processes that have been occurring continuously in the ocean's depths throughout the entire history of human civilization, entirely unknown to us until the technology to listen for them was developed. What we know about the acoustic life of the deep ocean is what a few decades of hydrophone monitoring has revealed. What we do not know is almost certainly vast. Speaking of vast and unexplored, the state of Alaska encompasses approximately 1.7 million square kilometers, an area larger than the combined area of Texas, California, and Montana, and it contains some of the most remote and geographically challenging terrain in North America. It also has, per capita, a disappearance rate that substantially exceeds that of any other state in the United States, and that has attracted sufficient attention to earn the region a nickname, the Alaska Triangle. The Alaska Triangle refers generally to the area bounded roughly by Juneau in the southeast, Barrow in the north, and Anchorage in the south, though the specific boundaries of the region invoked in this context are variable depending on the source. What is consistent across analyses of Alaska's missing person statistics is that people disappear in Alaska at rates that significantly exceed what the state's relatively small population and its status as a major destination for wilderness recreation would predict, even accounting for the obvious environmental hazards of the terrain. The most famous disappearance associated with the Alaska Triangle occurred on October 16, 1972, when a small Cessna 310 carrying House Majority Leader Hale Boggs of Louisiana, one of the most powerful politicians in the United States Congress, along with 3 other passengers, disappeared on a flight between Anchorage and Juneau. The search that followed was the largest aerial search in the history of Alaska at the time, involving dozens of aircraft and searching over the course of more than a month before being called off. No trace of the aircraft or its passengers was ever found. The terrain over which the flight passed, heavily glaciated with complex weather patterns in an era before GPS and modern electronic flight aids, was acknowledged as among the most challenging search environments in North America. But the completeness of the disappearance, no wreckage, no debris, no survival signals, was noted as unusual even in the context of Alaska's harsh environment. Alaska's indigenous peoples, the Tlingit, Athabascan, Yupik, and other groups with long histories in the region, have their own frameworks for understanding the territory's relationship to disappearance. Some traditions describe specific locations as places of power or transition where the boundary between the physical world and other dimensions is permeable. The Kushtaka, a shape-shifting entity from Tlingit tradition capable of taking human or otter form and known to lure travelers away from safety, is one of the more specific indigenous conceptualizations of the dangers that the Alaskan wilderness poses to the unprepared. These traditions are not merely superstition, they encode generations of accumulated practical knowledge about where the terrain is most dangerous and where human judgment is most likely to be compromised by disorientation, cold, or other hazards. The prosaic reality of many Alaska disappearances is clear. The state's combination of extreme weather, challenging terrain, sparse communications infrastructure, and large numbers of relatively inexperienced wilderness visitors creates conditions where accidents leading to disappearance without trace are more common than in more accessible environments. Small aircraft accidents in remote mountains can produce wreckage completely buried by snow or carried away by glacial movement within weeks. Bodies in wilderness environments are consumed by scavengers and the elements with a completeness that is rarely appreciated by people accustomed to the forensic realities of more populated regions. The Alaska Triangle's extraordinary disappearance rate almost certainly reflects these practical realities more than anything supernatural or inexplicable. But the completeness of some disappearances, including not just the Boggs aircraft but a significant number of other individuals whose disappearances have produced no physical evidence of any kind, remains a specific puzzle that the practical explanation does not fully resolve. In some cases, searches of extraordinary thoroughness in terrain that should have been capable of retaining physical evidence have found nothing at all. This specific pattern, not the high overall disappearance rate, which is explicable, but the specific subset of disappearances that left no physical trace in terrain where physical traces should have been left, is what continues to attract attention to the Alaska Triangle as something more than simply a dangerous wilderness. From the wilderness of Alaska, we travel to a very different kind of specific location, a stone bridge in the Dumbartonshire region of Scotland, in the grounds of Overtown House, a Victorian mansion near the town of Dumbarton. The Overtown Bridge is a modest stone arch bridge, perhaps 50 feet long, crossing a gorge above the Overtown Burn, a small river flowing through the estate grounds. It is not a remarkable structure. It is not a famous landmark. What it has become over the past 5 decades is the site of an accumulation of deeply puzzling behavior by dogs. Dogs walking near Overtoun Bridge with their owners have, since the 1950s, been documented jumping from the bridge wall into the gorge below, a drop of approximately 50 feet onto the rocky stream bed. The behavior is not occasional or rare. Conservative estimates put the number of dogs that have jumped from Overtoun Bridge at over 50 in the past 60 years, with peak periods where multiple dogs jumped in a single month. A significant number of the dogs that have jumped have died on impact or from injuries sustained in the fall. Some have survived, a few have climbed back up the gorge and, according to accounts from witnesses, jumped again. The behavior is species-specific, but cats, humans, and other animals do not exhibit it at the bridge. It appears to be concentrated at a specific location on the bridge, the right-hand side under an overhang. It appears to occur more frequently in good weather than in rain or overcast conditions. And it consistently involves dogs that are not exhibiting distress before they jump. Owners describe their dogs trotting confidently toward the spot and then simply leaping over the edge without warning. Investigators who have studied the Overtoun Bridge have proposed several possible explanations, all involving the extraordinary sensitivity of a dog's olfactory system. Dogs possess a sense of smell estimated to be between 10,000 and 100,000 times more sensitive than human smell. The specific location on the bridge from which dogs most commonly leap is positioned above an area of vegetation that is known habitat for mink, small carnivorous mammals introduced to Scotland from North America and now widespread in the country's waterways. Mink produce powerful scent markings, and the concentrated scent of mink in the gorge below the bridge, channeled upward by the specific wind patterns produced by the gorge's geometry, might be detectable by dogs on the bridge as an overwhelming olfactory stimulus. If this explanation is correct, the dogs are not jumping from the bridge in a state of distress or confusion, but are being drawn by an irresistible scent toward what they perceive to be prey below, and the jump is a hunting response rather than a suicidal one. This interpretation is consistent with the specificity of the behavior to a particular location on the bridge, the location where the scent is most concentrated, and with the tendency for dogs with high prey drive, particularly long-nosed breeds, to be overrepresented among the cases. The mink scent hypothesis is reasonable and is probably the most scientifically credible explanation available, but it has not been experimentally confirmed. No one has specifically demonstrated that the scent levels at the critical location on the bridge are sufficient to produce the observed response in dogs, and no controlled experiment has established the causal chain from olfactory stimulus to jumping behavior. The behavior continues. The specific mechanism, while proposed, is not established, and the question of why this specific location, and apparently not other locations with comparable mink populations, produces this specific response with such extraordinary consistency remains incompletely answered. Thylacinus cynocephalus, the thylacine, also known as the Tasmanian tiger, was officially declared extinct in 1936, the year the last known individual died in the Hobart Zoo. By the time of that death, the species had been hunted to virtual elimination across its former range, first eliminated from mainland Australia by competition with dingoes and hunting pressure by indigenous people over the previous few thousand years, then reduced in Tasmania to a remnant population that was systematically hunted by European settlers who considered it a threat to livestock and paid government bounties for its kill. The last wild thylacine was probably shot in 1930. The last captive individual died on September 7, 1936 in Hobart Zoo, reportedly because the keeper forgot to let it inside for the night during a cold snap. The extinction of the thylacine is not the mystery is what has happened since. Since the official declaration of extinction in 1936, there have been thousands of reported sightings of animals matching the description of the thylacine in Tasmania, in mainland Australia, and, in a handful of cases, in Papua New Guinea. The Tasmanian sightings are the most numerous and the most geographically concentrated. They cluster in specific remote areas of western and central Tasmania, in terrain that is among the most difficult and least surveyed wilderness in Australia. The specific descriptions that witnesses provide, or a dog-like animal with stripes across its back, a stiff kangaroo-like tail, a distinctive hopping gait, are consistent with what we know about the thylacine's morphology and behavior and are not consistent with any other known animal in the Australian fauna. Official expeditions mounted to investigate thylacine sightings have repeatedly returned without confirmation. Camera trap surveys, the deployment of motion-triggered cameras in areas of reported sightings, have so far produced no verified thylacine images, though they have produced extensive documentation of the other wildlife in the areas searched. The scientific consensus is that the thylacine is extinct. The specific quality of the evidence that would be required to revise this conclusion, a live animal, a fresh carcass, or unambiguous photographic evidence, has not been produced despite decades of searching and thousands of reported observations. But the absence of confirmatory evidence is not the same as confirmatory absence. The Western Highlands of Tasmania are among the most rugged and impenetrable terrain in the country. Camera trap surveys, while extensive, have not been comprehensive. The area is simply too large and the terrain too difficult for complete coverage. Thylacines, if they survived in small numbers, would be extraordinarily secretive and extraordinarily low density, inhabiting ranges of hundreds of square kilometers per individual if their behavior was anything like that of comparable large carnivores. The probability of encountering or photographing such an animal, even in a several-year survey, might be low enough that the absence of photographic evidence is not statistically dispositive. The thylacine has become a symbol of multiple different things simultaneously. For the science of conservation, it is the emblem of extinction driven by human activity, specifically by bounty hunting, that continued even as the species was clearly declining to critically low numbers. For biology, it is the most extreme example of convergent evolution in the mammalian record. An animal that looked and behaved like a dog and bore superficial resemblance to a tiger, but was a marsupial related to kangaroos and wallabies that had independently evolved these features through adaptation to the same ecological role. For the specific people who search for it in the Tasmanian wilderness, and they are still there, still searching, still filing reports of encounters with something they cannot identify, it represents the possibility that extinction is not always final, that nature contains surprises that the official record has not yet acknowledged. The truth about the thylacine's current status cannot be established definitively from available evidence. It may be extinct, it may persist in very small numbers in remote terrain. The evidence currently available is not sufficient to distinguish between these possibilities, and that uncertainty in the context of a species that humanity drove to the edge of existence through deliberate hunting carries a specific weight that purely scientific uncertainty typically does not. Ball lightning is one of the most thoroughly documented phenomena in the history of atmospheric science and one of the most comprehensively unexplained. It has been reported by credible witnesses across every inhabited continent, in every era of recorded history, and in contexts ranging from open fields during thunderstorms to the interiors of closed buildings, aircraft cabins, and submarines. The descriptions across these thousands of accounts are remarkably consistent in their core features. A glowing sphere, typically between 2 and 50 centimeters in diameter, usually appearing in association with thunderstorm activity, floating or drifting slowly through the air, persisting for periods ranging from seconds to minutes, capable of passing through glass and other solid objects, typically ending either in a silent disappearance or in a brief explosion, occasionally leaving behind a sulfurous smell or minor burn marks. The consistency of the descriptions is itself significant. If ball lightning were a rare atmospheric optical illusion or a systematic misperception of known phenomena, you would expect the descriptions to vary more with the specific circumstances and the specific witnesses, to reflect individual variation in perception and interpretation rather than a consistent underlying reality. Instead, witnesses who have never heard of ball lightning, who have no cultural framework for interpreting what they have seen, consistently describe features that match what other witnesses in other places and times have independently described. The spherical geometry, the slow drift, the luminosity, the apparent ability to pass through solid surfaces, the specific duration range, all of these features appear repeatedly in accounts that have no obvious common source. And yet the phenomenon has resisted scientific explanation with an obstinacy that is itself remarkable. Every scientific decade since the phenomenon was formally described has produced its own leading theoretical framework, and each framework has eventually been found inadequate to account for the full range of observed characteristics. Plasma theories, proposals that ball lightning is a self-sustaining ball of plasma, have difficulty explaining how a plasma ball could maintain its coherence and luminosity at room temperature for tens of seconds without a continuous energy source. Microwave cavity theories, proposals that ball lightning is produced by microwave radiation focused by the geometry of nearby structures, cannot account for the observations in open outdoor environments where no such focusing structure exists. Antimatter theories, strange matter theories, theories involving quantum effects in ordinary matter. Each has been proposed and each faces specific difficulties. In 2012, Chinese researchers in Inner Mongolia reported the accidental capture of what appears to be the first instrumentally recorded natural ball lightning event. A team conducting spectroscopic observations of thunderstorms recorded on both video and spectrographs an event that appeared to show a glowing sphere approximately 5 meters in diameter, persisting for approximately 1.6 seconds. The spectrographic data showed emission lines consistent with silicon, iron, and calcium, elements present in soil, suggesting that the ball lightning in this instance was formed from soil material vaporized by a lightning strike. This observation, if it is indeed ball lightning, which is not universally agreed, provides the first physical measurement of the composition of a natural event. But a single observation, with its specific properties, does not account for the full range of the phenomenon. The events described in historical accounts range from centimeters to meters in diameter, from seconds to minutes in duration, from appearing in the open to appearing in sealed rooms and aircraft fuselages, from dissipating quietly to exploding loudly. If they are all the same phenomenon, that phenomenon has properties spanning an enormous range. If they are not all the same phenomenon, if ball lightning is a label applied to several different processes that produce superficially similar appearances, then the goal of a single theoretical explanation is probably inappropriate. What is clear is that something real is being observed. Thousands of accounts from credible witnesses across centuries and cultures cannot all be misperceptions of mundane phenomena. Something produces glowing spheres that float through the air for seconds to minutes and then disappear or explode. That something has not been identified, controlled, or replicated in a laboratory. It may be related to thunderstorms, or it may be a separate atmospheric phenomenon that appears preferentially in the presence of thunderstorm electrical activity. The specific physical process remains unknown. In the year 331 BCE, Alexander the Great founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, at the mouth of the western branch of the Nile Delta. The city he founded became, over the following centuries, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a capital of Hellenistic civilization, home to the famous library, center of commerce between the Mediterranean world and the East, a city of perhaps 500,000 people at its peak. Associated with Alexandria, approximately 32 kilometers to the east, was a city called Thonis by the Egyptians and Heracleion by the Greeks, an important port city that controlled the northern approach to the Nile and that served as the principal gateway for Mediterranean trade into Egypt for centuries. Historical references to Thonis Heracleion appear in ancient sources. Herodotus mentioned it. Greek myths located the city as the place where Helen and Paris stopped during the Trojan War. Egyptian texts referenced its importance as a religious and commercial center. And then, sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era, the city disappeared from the historical record. It became essentially lost, known only from those scattered textual references, its location uncertain, its physical reality unverified. In 2000, French underwater archaeologist Franck Gaudiot and his team, working in the shallow waters of Abu Qir Bay off the coast of Alexandria, found it. The lost city of Thonis Heracleion was not hidden in a remote jungle or buried deep in the earth. It was lying on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, in water between 4 and 9 meters deep, directly accessible to any boat with diving equipment. It had been there, approximately 6 kilometers offshore of the modern Egyptian coast, throughout all the centuries of its supposed disappearance, preserved by the sediment of the bay in conditions that have maintained extraordinary amounts of detail. What the excavations of Thonis Heraklion have produced over the more than 20 years since the city's rediscovery is remarkable. The physical layout of the city has been mapped, its harbour, its grand temple dedicated to Amun-Gereb, its residential areas, its administrative quarters. Hundreds of statues have been recovered, including stelae with royal decrees in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and ancient Greek, providing bilingual texts comparable in their historical significance to the Rosetta Stone. Hundreds of bronze and gold objects, ritual artifacts, everyday items of daily life, all of it preserved on the seafloor in conditions that have maintained far more detail than most terrestrial sites of comparable age. But the mystery is not the content of the city, extraordinary as that is. The mystery is what happened to it. How did an important, well-documented port city simply sink beneath the sea? The answer involves a combination of geological processes that have been partially reconstructed from the physical evidence, but that remain incompletely understood in their specific mechanisms and timing. The area around the Nile Delta has been geologically unstable throughout the Holocene. The delta itself is a young geological feature, constantly shaped by the deposition of sediment, and the land surface in the region is prone to liquefaction, the process by which waterlogged sediment, when subjected to sufficient mechanical disturbance, temporarily behaves like a liquid rather than a solid. An earthquake of sufficient magnitude could cause the sediment underlying a city built on the delta edge to liquefy, causing the buildings above to sink rapidly into the softened ground. Evidence from the Thonis Heraklion site is consistent with rapid subsidence events. The way the monumental architecture has come to rest suggests it sank relatively rapidly rather than collapsing gradually over centuries. The timing and trigger of the city's submergence remain uncertain. The city was occupied well into the first millennium CE, but at some point the combination of gradual subsidence, episodic earthquakes, and the ongoing rise in Mediterranean sea levels produced conditions from which the settlement could not recover. The city was not abandoned. It was submerged while still occupied, apparently with insufficient warning for the organized removal of everything of value. The statues and the ritual objects and the everyday items that the excavators have recovered are not the contents of a carefully packed archive. They are the material of a living city caught in the process of destruction. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, a farmhand named Lorenz Schlittenbauer drove his horse-drawn cart toward the remote Hinterkaifeck farm in rural Bavaria, Germany. He had been at the farm several days earlier and had encountered no one unusual for a working farm, but had seen smoke rising from the chimney, indicating someone was inside. When he arrived with two other men to investigate, they found the farmhouse locked and discovered what investigators would spend the following century trying to explain. The Gruber family, farmer Andreas Gruber, his wife Casilia, his widowed daughter Victoria, her two children Casilia and Josef, and the newly hired maid Maria Baumgartner, had all been murdered. The adults and the older child had been killed in the farm's barn with what appeared to be a mattock, a heavy agricultural tool, their skulls fractured by blows of extraordinary force. Maria Baumgartner and the infant Josef had been killed in their beds. The murders had apparently occurred several days earlier based on the state of decomposition. The cows and livestock in the barn had been fed and watered in the interim, suggesting that whoever killed the family had remained on the property for several days afterward, living in the farmhouse and tending the animals before disappearing. The murderer, despite extensive investigation by the Bavarian State Police that included interviews with approximately 100 witnesses and forensic analysis of the crime scene, was never identified. The case remains officially unsolved. What the investigation established was deeply unsettling. In the weeks before the murders, the Gruber family had reported finding footprints in the snow leading toward the farm from the nearby forest. Footprints coming in, with none going out. They had heard unexplained sounds coming from the attic. Their daughter had reported seeing a strange man near the farm. The newspaper deliveries, which should have been taken in, had been accumulating for days. A set of house keys was missing from the farm, and had been missing for several months before the murders. The picture that emerges is of someone who was familiar with the farm and its routines, who had been watching and perhaps visiting before the murders, who killed the family in the barn while they were working, and then systematically killed the others who came to investigate the noise, and who then spent at least several days living in the farmhouse of the people they had just murdered. The specific motivation for the crime and the specific identity of the perpetrator has never been established. More than 100 years after the murders, the Hinterkaifeck case remains open and continues to generate investigation and analysis. In 2007, students at the police college in Fürstenfeldbruck conducted a new analysis of all available evidence using modern criminal investigation methods, ultimately identifying a specific suspect, a neighbor who had a documented grievance against the Gruber family and who had disappeared from the region shortly after the murders. But acknowledging that the evidence was insufficient to constitute proof, the suspect died before the investigation was concluded. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders specifically disturbing, and what distinguishes them from the general category of unsolved rural murders, is the evidence of extended occupation before and after the killings. Someone was at that farm who should not have been. Someone was watching, waiting, living in the margins of the family's ordinary life, invisible to them until the moment of violence. And then, after the violence, someone stayed, fed the animals, maintained the appearance of normal activity from outside, and eventually walked away, leaving no trace sufficient to identify them, back into anonymity, and was never found. In the northwest corner of Vermont, in the area around the town of Bennington in Windham County, 5 people disappeared in the years between 1945 and 1950. They disappeared in circumstances that, while individually explicable by reference to accident or crime, collectively constitute a geographic and temporal cluster unusual enough to have generated its own designation, the Bennington Triangle, coined by author Joseph Citro in the early 1990s. The first was Middy Rivers, a 74-year-old hunting and fishing guide with deep knowledge of the local terrain, who was leading a hunting party on November 12, 1945. The group was returning from a hunt, with Rivers ahead of the others. When the rest of the party arrived at a specific point in the trail, Rivers was simply gone. He had been ahead of them on a trail he knew thoroughly, and then he was not there. A search found one rifle cartridge that may have been his. Nothing else. The second was Paula Jean Weldon, the 18-year-old college student whose disappearance from the long trail we discussed in an earlier script. The young woman whom 2 witnesses watched round a bend on a hiking trail and found absent when they reached the same bend moments later. She disappeared on December 1, 1946, approximately 15 miles from where Middy Rivers vanished the previous year. The third was James Tedford, a veteran from Bennington who disappeared on December 1, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day after Paula Jean Weldon's disappearance. Tedford had boarded a bus in St. Albans, Vermont, and was seen by other passengers on the bus during the journey. When the bus reached Bennington, Tedford's seat was empty. His belongings were in the luggage rack. The bus had not stopped between the last confirmed sighting and Bennington. No one saw him leave. The fourth and fifth were 8-year-old Paul Jepson, who disappeared from near his family's vehicle in October 1950 while his mother was occupied with work nearby, and Frida Langer, who disappeared from a camping trip with her cousin in October 1950, also in the Glastonbury Mountain area. Langer's body was the only one of the 5 to be found, discovered the following spring in an area that search parties had searched thoroughly without finding her, so thoroughly searched that the discovery of the body in a location that should have been covered raised the question of whether it had been placed there after the search. The Bennington Triangle's 5 disappearances clustered geographically around the area of Glastonbury Mountain, a remote highland in the Green Mountains of Vermont, and temporally within a 6-year period. They involve people of radically different ages, backgrounds, and circumstances who appear to have left no trace in terrain that should, in several cases, have retained physical evidence of their fate. No bodies other than Langer's were found, despite extensive searches. No arrests were ever made. No cause was established for any of the disappearances. Individually, each disappearance could be explained an elderly man with a heart condition who wandered off a trail, a young woman inadequately prepared for winter hiking, a depressed veteran who stepped off a bus, a young child who wandered away from his family. Collectively, the cluster demands more than individual explanations can provide without offering anything specific to replace them. The Glastonbury mountain area is remote, heavily forested, and prone to extreme weather, which accounts for the difficulty of searches and the absence of physical evidence. Whether the cluster of disappearances reflects a genuine environmental hazard specific to the area, a statistical coincidence, or something else entirely, remains undetermined. At the southern end of the Red Sea in February of 1948, the Dutch freighter SS Orang Medan sent a distress signal that has never been fully explained. Other ships in the area picked up the signal, which was transmitted in Morse code, and described a catastrophic event aboard the vessel before dissolving into unintelligible dots and dashes and then going silent. When rescue ships reached the Orang Medan, they found her afloat in calm conditions with no obvious external damage. When the boarding party climbed onto the deck, they found the entire crew dead. Not merely dead in specific and disturbing circumstances. The bodies were scattered across the decks and in the holds and in the wheelhouse, lying in positions that witnesses described as suggesting terror. Arms outstretched, eyes wide open, faces contorted in expressions described as fearful or anguished. There were no marks of violence on the bodies, no apparent injuries, no sign of the kind of struggle that would typically accompany mass murder, or of the bodily contortion that would typically accompany mass poisoning. The ship's dog was also found dead. Witnesses reported that the temperature in certain areas of the ship's interior was unusually cold despite the tropical heat outside. Shortly after the boarding party returned to their rescue vessel, the Orang Medan caught fire and subsequently exploded. The explosion was violent enough to lift the hull partially out of the water before the ship sank rapidly. The fire and sinking destroyed all physical evidence that the ship itself might have provided about the cause of the crew's deaths. The Orang Medan case is complicated by significant documentation problems. The initial distress signal was intercepted and recorded, and this record appears in contemporaneous reports in publications that can be dated to 1948. But the physical ship, its registry, its construction records, its registration with maritime authorities, has not been found in the surviving records of the period. Researchers who have investigated the case have been unable to confirm the ship's existence in the official records that should document any vessel of this type operating in the shipping lanes of the era. This absence has led some researchers to question whether the incident occurred at all, or whether it was a composite of several different incidents, or whether the records were deliberately obscured. The explanations proposed for the deaths of the crew range from the mundane to the exotic. Methane gas or other toxic fumes from the ship's cargo, possibly including chemical weapons material being illegally transported, could have killed the crew quickly in ways that left no obvious external marks, and a fire or explosion caused by those same materials could explain the subsequent sinking. Carbon monoxide poisoning could produce rapid death without external signs. Botulism from contaminated food supplies has been proposed. Each of these explanations accounts for the deaths, but has difficulty accounting for the specific descriptions of the bodies, the positions, the facial expressions, the temperature anomaly, which may, of course, reflect the distorted perceptions of witnesses responding to an extreme situation. The Orang Medan sits in the category of mysteries, where the documentation is insufficient to establish what the basic facts were. Whether the ship existed, whether the incident occurred, and whether the contemporaneous accounts are accurate, these baseline questions have not been conclusively answered. What the case illustrates is the specific challenge posed by maritime mysteries. The ocean has an extraordinary capacity to destroy evidence, and events that occurred on the open sea in the era before electronic record-keeping and satellite tracking are, in many cases, permanently beyond the reach of definitive historical investigation. Every year, on specific nights around the time of Buddhist Lent in October, something remarkable happens in and above the Mekong River along the border between Thailand and Laos. Thousands of people, Thai and Lao locals, international tourists, television crews and researchers, gather along the riverbanks in areas around the city of Nong Khai to watch balls of reddish light rise from the surface of the river, ascend silently to heights of tens to hundreds of meters, and then disappear. The lights appear by the hundreds over several nights, typically without sound, typically without smell, and with a consistency from year to year that makes their occurrence predictable enough to have become the basis of a major regional festival. The Naga fireballs, named for the mythological serpent deity associated with the Mekong in Buddhist tradition, have been observed and recorded for centuries. The legend holds that the lights are produced by the Naga serpents who inhabit the river, breathing fire to honor the Buddha on his return from heaven. The cultural significance of the phenomenon is enormous in the region, and the annual occurrence of the lights coincides with the Wan Auk Phansa festival, one of the most important in the Buddhist calendar. Scientific explanations for the Naga fireballs have been proposed and studied, and they have generated significant controversy in Thailand and Laos, where the phenomenon's cultural importance means that naturalistic explanations are sometimes received with hostility. The leading scientific hypothesis proposes that the lights are produced by the ignition of phosphine or methane gas, produced by organic decomposition in the river sediment, released in bubbles that ignite spontaneously when they reach the oxygen-rich atmosphere above the water surface. The Mekong in the relevant section is slow-moving and carries large amounts of organic matter that accumulates in the sediment and decomposes under anaerobic conditions, producing flammable gases. The October timing corresponds to the end of the monsoon season and specific changes in river water pressure that might trigger the release of accumulated gases. In 2002, a team of Thai army soldiers stationed along the river fired rifles into the darkness across the Mekong on a night when Naga fireballs were reported. The shooting was apparently intended to debunk the lights by demonstrating that the firing positions of hidden soldiers on the Laotian side of the river were their true cause. The incident, which was widely reported and produced significant political tension between Thailand and Laos, did not resolve the scientific question but illustrated how intensely the cultural stakes around the phenomenon are felt. The gas bubble hypothesis has difficulty fully explaining all features of the observed lights. The lights appear to rise from specific locations rather than distributed across the river surface, which would be expected if the gas release were driven by diffuse decomposition across the sediment. The lights rise consistently to similar heights before disappearing, which is not easily explained by simply igniting gas bubbles of varying sizes. Some reports describe lights appearing in dry years when the river level is low and conditions for the specific hypothetical mechanism would be different, and the extreme cultural significance of the phenomenon, combined with the October timing that is culturally meaningful and the fact that the lights coincide perfectly with an important religious occasion, makes it difficult to completely separate observation from expectation and participation from documentation. What the Naga fireballs illustrate in the broadest sense is the specific category of mystery that involves natural phenomena deeply embedded in cultural frameworks. The lights are real in the sense that large numbers of sober, experienced witnesses, including scientists, observe them regularly in conditions that do not suggest mass hallucination. Their natural cause may be real and may be the gas combustion hypothesis. But the specific details that make the hypothesis completely convincing have not yet been established, and the cultural context of the phenomenon makes objective investigation particularly difficult to conduct without producing controversy disproportionate to the scientific stakes of the question. In the middle of Death Valley National Park in California, on a dry lakebed called the Racetrack Playa, there are stones that move. They are not small pebbles, many of them weigh several hundred pounds. They rest on the surface of the perfectly flat, perfectly dry, perfectly cracked claybed of the ancient lake bed, and behind each of them extends a long track in the clay, documenting a journey of tens or hundreds of meters that each stone has made across the playa surface. No human has ever seen one move, no one has been present to witness the movement, and, for decades, no one could explain how they got from where they started to where they ended up. The Racetrack Playa sailing stones have been known to geologists and visitors to Death Valley since the early 20th century, and they have been the subject of increasing scientific attention since the 1970s. The tracks are real, the stones are real, the displacement is unambiguous. Stones that began at one location have moved to other locations, leaving continuous tracks in the clay that document the path of movement. Some of the tracks are straight, some curve. Some stones, moving in parallel from the same starting area, have moved in different directions, indicating that the force driving the movement was not uniformly applied from a single direction. Some stones have been moved and then appear to have moved back toward their starting points, producing zigzag tracks. The dominant hypothesis for most of the period between the track's discovery and the early 21st century was wind. That strong winds across the playa surface, in conditions where the clay was wetted by occasional rainfall, could move the stones by direct wind pressure. But the force required to move stones of the observed masses across a flat surface, even a wet one, substantially exceeds what meteorological records suggested the winds in the area typically produced, and the asymmetric tracks, stones moving in multiple directions simultaneously, were inconsistent with wind as the primary driver. In 2014, a team of researchers from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography published a paper in PLOS One reporting direct observation of stone movement at the racetrack playa for the first time. The mechanism they observed was not what most hypotheses had predicted. A combination of conditions was required: winter rain that produced a shallow temporary pond on the playa surface, followed by cold temperatures that froze the surface of this pond into a thin sheet of ice, followed by warming that caused the ice sheet to melt and break up into panels, and finally modest winds that moved the floating ice panels across the still liquid water layer beneath them. Stones resting on the playa floor and partially encased in the floating ice panels were dragged along by the moving ice, moving at speeds of a few meters per minute, leaving tracks in the clay as the ice moved them. The ice panel mechanism, which the researchers called sailing ice, elegantly explains the specific features of the tracks that previous hypotheses could not: the movement of stones in multiple directions simultaneously, different ice panels carrying different stones in the directions the panels are moving, the modest speeds implied by the gradual track formation, and the ability to move very heavy stones with relatively light forces because the friction between the ice and the water surface is extremely low. But the 2014 paper, while representing a major advance, also acknowledged significant remaining uncertainty. The specific conditions required for the mechanism, the precise combination of rainfall, freezing, and subsequent thawing, are rare enough at racetrack playa that the observations in 2014 represent only a small number of movement events over a relatively short monitoring period. Whether all the tracks at racetrack playa were produced by this mechanism, or whether some movement has occurred under different conditions, is not established. The tracks accumulate over decades and centuries, and the conditions that produced them may vary. The sailing ice mechanism is now the consensus explanation for the racetrack playa stones, but the full history of how all the existing tracks were made remains incompletely documented. In October 2003, a set of remains was found in the Atacama Desert in Chile, in an abandoned town called La Noria, by a man searching for archaeological artifacts in old mines and buildings in the area. What he found was a skeletal specimen approximately 15 centimeters long, roughly the size of a fetus or very small infant, with features that were immediately striking and that would spend the next decade generating scientific investigation and controversy. The specimen was purchased by a Spanish businessman and eventually became the subject of a 2013 documentary that brought it to wide public attention. It was nicknamed Ata for the Atacama Desert. The features of the Ata specimen that attracted attention were its unusual morphology. The skull was elongated and pointed, not in the way of the Paracas skulls discussed in other contexts, but in a specific cone-like shape called a turricephaly. The ribs were fewer than normal, only 10 pairs rather than the 12 pairs in a typical human. The bones were unusually dense for a specimen of this size, suggesting a degree of skeletal maturity inconsistent with the size if Ata were a fetus or a premature infant. The teeth, visible in X-ray analysis, showed a development pattern suggesting an age at death of approximately 6 to 8 years, incompatible with the body size. The combination of features, the overall size of a fetus, the bone density and dental development of a child several years old, the unusual skull shape, the reduced rib count, produced a specimen that standard medical and forensic interpretation could not straightforwardly classify. Some of the early commentators on the specimen, most without direct access to the physical evidence, proposed that it might represent a non-human primate, an unusual form of human dwarfism, and this option was always present in the public discussion, an extraterrestrial or previously unknown humanoid species. In 2018, a team of researchers led by Dr. Gary Nolan of Stanford University published a detailed genetic analysis of the ATA specimen in the journal Genome Research. The DNA extracted from the specimen was unambiguously human. The genetic analysis also identified a set of specific mutations in genes involved in bone development and growth, which the researchers proposed could account for several of the unusual morphological features, including the reduced rib count and the unusual skeletal proportions. The study concluded that Atta was a human individual who had died, probably shortly before or after birth, and whose unusual features were the product of genetic mutations affecting development. The Nolan paper was widely reported as having solved the Atta mystery, and in its most important dimension, the question of whether the specimen was human, the conclusion is clear and well supported, but the specific genetic explanation proposed for the unusual morphology remains contested. Some researchers have pointed out that the specific mutations identified have not been shown to produce, individually or in combination, the specific phenotype observed in Atta. The question of how the developmental anomalies were produced, while now clearly within the domain of human genetics rather than extraterrestrial biology, is not fully resolved. The Atacama specimen continues to appear in scientific literature as the subject of ongoing analysis. In the 12th century, in the village of Woolpit in the county of Suffolk in England, there appeared two children who could not explain where they had come from. They were a brother and a sister. They were found, according to the medieval chronicle accounts, near a pit of wolves from which the village took its name. They spoke no English or any language that anyone in the village recognized, and they were green. Not metaphorically green. Their skin was described by the chroniclers, specifically by Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, both of whom wrote about the incident in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, as green in colour, the same green as unripe grass, covering their entire bodies, and they refused to eat anything offered to them until some time after their arrival they were given raw green beans, which they ate eagerly. Over time they learned to eat other foods, their green colour faded, and they eventually learned to speak English. The brother died not long after arrival, apparently weakened by the transition. The sister survived, was baptized, and according to the accounts married a man in a nearby village and lived out her life in England. Before her death, she gave an account, reported by the chroniclers, of where she and her brother had come from. They had lived, she said, in a place called St. Martin's Land, where it was always twilight and where everything was green. They had been herding their father's cattle when they followed the animals into a cave and, after walking through it in darkness, guided by the sound of bells from the surface, emerged into the bright light of Woolpit, where they were found. The green children of Woolpit are one of the most discussed anomalies in medieval history. They cannot be dismissed as pure legend. They appear in two independent chronicles written by authors who were contemporaries of the events described, and both accounts share core features that suggest a common underlying event. But they also cannot be taken as straightforwardly historical in the modern sense, because the specific features described, the green skin, the unknown language, the description of the twilight land of St. Martin's, exist in a medieval documentary tradition where the boundaries between the factual, the legendary, and the deliberately symbolic were different from what they are in modern historical writing. Proposed explanations span a very wide range. The most mundane invokes simple misidentification. The children were ordinary children from a distant region who were suffering from chlorosis, an iron deficiency anemia once common in poorly nourished populations that can produce a greenish tint in the skin, and that is called green sickness in older medical literature. In this interpretation, the children were perhaps orphans displaced by some crisis, a raid, a famine, a massacre, who wandered to Woolpit from elsewhere and whose language difficulty reflected not an unknown tongue but a remote English dialect or a different language altogether, and whose green color reflected malnutrition. When their diet improved in Woolpit, the green faded, consistent with the resolution of nutritional anemia. This explanation is the most scientifically respectable and is probably the closest to the truth, but it does not fully account for all features of the account. The consistency of the green color across the entire body and across two individuals, the specific nature of the language barrier, and the girl's own account of their origin, which, while clearly filtered through the interpretive frameworks of a medieval woman explaining an experience she understood in medieval terms, is too specific and too internally consistent to be dismissed entirely as fabrication. The green children of Woolpit are exactly the kind of mystery that history produces. An event well enough documented to be worth taking seriously, too distant in time and too embedded in a foreign cultural context to be definitively explained. They are a window into a specific moment in 12th century Suffolk, a moment that was extraordinary enough to be recorded by two independent chroniclers, and a moment whose specific reality remains, 8 centuries later, beyond the reach of certainty. The green children came from somewhere, and wherever that somewhere was, the specific knowledge of it died with the girl who could have told us, and with the community in 12th century Suffolk that watched her grow old in a language she had learned after arriving. The mystery of the green children sits behind an evidence horizon that will not move. But not all mysteries are like that. Some of the ones that follow are genuinely approachable, closer to resolution, richer in surviving physical evidence, and in some cases actively being worked on by researchers who believe the answer is within reach. We continue. In the latter decades of the 20th century, as satellite imaging technology improved and the resolution of publicly available aerial photographs of the Amazon basin increased, researchers began noticing something in the images of the Western Amazon that had no place in the conventional understanding of pre-Columbian South America. Geometric shapes, circles, squares, hexagons, complex compositions of multiple forms, were visible on the forest floor in areas where the tree cover had been removed by agriculture or ranching. The shapes were made of earth, defined by trenches cut into the ground rather than by structures built above it. They were large, individual enclosures ranging from roughly 100 to 300 meters in diameter, and they were not rare. As more satellite coverage became available and more researchers began looking, more structures appeared. The current count stands at over 500 individual geometric earthworks distributed across approximately 13,000 square kilometers of what is now the states of Acre in Brazil and adjacent parts of Bolivia. The structures were built. Carbon dating of charcoal found within the features indicates between roughly 1200 and 1450 CE, the final centuries before European contact with the Americas disrupted and ultimately destroyed the civilizations of the Amazon basin. The culture or cultures that built them are referred to by archaeologists as the Acre geoglyph builders, a descriptive designation that acknowledges we do not know what they called themselves. They left no writing, no surviving oral tradition directly describing the structures, and no substantial architecture other than the earthworks themselves. What they left are the shapes, 500 geometric forms cut into the earth across an area larger than England, each one requiring the organized labors of a substantial community over an extended period, and collectively requiring a population and a social organization of a scale that had simply not been credited to the pre-Columbian Amazon. The specific mystery of the Amazon geoglyphs is not their existence, which is now firmly established by the physical evidence, but their purpose. The structures do not appear to have been settlements. The absence of domestic refuse, cooking evidence, structural post holes, and the other debris of habitation within the enclosures is consistent across the surveyed sites. They are not agricultural features. The shapes and orientations do not correspond to drainage channels or cultivation beds. They are not defensive work, i.e. the ditches open inward rather than outward, and would not serve as effective barriers against attack from outside. The most coherent interpretation currently available proposes that the structures served ceremonial or ritual purposes, that they were gathering places used periodically by dispersed communities for festivals, ceremonies, or political assemblies, and that the specific geometry of each structure encoded symbolic meanings in a visual language we have lost. Several of the structures show possible astronomical alignments. The entrances to some enclosures are oriented toward the positions of specific celestial events, solstice sunrises, equinox sunsets, in ways that suggest the calendar was encoded in the architecture. If confirmed across the full population of structures, astronomical orientation would be significant evidence that the structures served a function related to the ritual marking of time, as ceremonial spaces for the celebration of calendrically significant moments. But the confirmation requires detailed survey of a large number of individual structures and the ongoing deforestation of the Western Amazon, which is simultaneously the process that reveals the structures and the process that damages them, means that some structures are being discovered and destroyed in the same moment. The population implied by 500 geometric earthworks across 13,000 square kilometers is substantial. Constructing and maintaining these structures required organized labor, sustained agricultural production to feed that labor, and a social structure capable of coordinating projects across a large geographic area over multiple generations. The Western Amazon in 1200 to 1450 CE was not the sparsely inhabited wilderness that European explorers described in the 16th century. It was a managed landscape supporting a large population whose organizational sophistication left its mark in geometric form on the forest floor. The diseases introduced by European contact after 1492, smallpox, measles, influenza, to which indigenous Americans had no prior immunity, killed this population with a speed and completeness that transformed the inhabited landscape into apparent wilderness within a century or two of first contact. By the time systematic scientific exploration of the Amazon began in the 19th century, the evidence of civilization had been reclaimed by forest, and the 19th century naturalists who documented the region's biology were walking through what they took to be pristine nature that was in fact the overgrown remnant of a managed agricultural landscape. The acceleration of Amazon deforestation in recent decades has produced, paradoxically, an acceleration in geoglyph discovery. Each new area of cleared land potentially reveals structures that the forest had covered. Researchers working in the region have developed protocols for rapid archaeological documentation of newly revealed sites before agricultural activity damages them beyond recovery. The race between discovery and destruction is ongoing and is not clearly being won by discovery. Estimates suggest that the structures so far documented represent a fraction of the total that existed across the region, that many more remain under intact forest, and that the full extent of the geoglyph building civilization has not been characterized. What can be said with confidence is that the conventional picture of the pre-Columbian Amazon as a lightly inhabited wilderness was wrong, and that the Amazon geoglyphs are the most direct physical evidence of what was actually there. A civilization of substantial scale whose specific nature, beliefs, social organization, and history we are only beginning to recover from the landscape it left behind. The Amazon geoglyphs were built by people whose names we do not know, whose language we cannot read, and whose civilization was destroyed before any written record of it was made. They communicated through geometry in forms that have survived in the earth for 6 centuries. 5 centuries after the last geoglyph was constructed on the other side of the world, a pilot communicated something in the most direct possible form, real-time radio narration, and then went silent. What he communicated and what it means is the next mystery. Frederick Valentich was 20 years old on October 21, 1978, 20 years old, holding a Class 4 instrument rating from the Australian Department of Transport, flying a Cessna 182 across Bass Strait from Moorabbin Airport, south of Melbourne, to King Island, to pick up crayfish for a group of friends. It was a clear evening, the conditions were good, he had made the flight before, he filed a flight plan, communicated with Melbourne Flight Service, and was 45 minutes into what should have been an unremarkable journey when everything stopped being unremarkable. At 7:06 p.m, Valentich contacted Melbourne Flight Service and asked if there was any known air traffic in his area at his altitude. He was told there was none. He said he could see a large aircraft below him, then above him. The conversation that followed lasted approximately 6 minutes. and it is available in its entirety in the records of the Australian Department of Transport. Reading the transcript is a specific experience. Valentich was calm throughout. He maintained standard radio protocol. His language was precise and professional. He was not panicking, he was narrating. He described the unknown aircraft as having 4 bright lights. He described it as moving at speed he could not estimate. He said it was approaching him from the east and orbiting above him. He said it was metallic and shining. He said it had a green light. He said his own engine was rough and coughing. He said the object was hovering above him. He said it was not an aircraft. Then there were 17 seconds of metallic scraping sound on the frequency. Then silence. The time was 7:12 p.m. Melbourne Flight Service attempted to re-establish contact. There was no response. The search that followed covered approximately 1,000 square kilometers of Bass Strait over the following days. No wreckage was found, no oil slick, no debris, no personal effects, no aircraft parts, no evidence of any kind that a Cessna 182 had come down in the area. The specific absence of surface evidence is the most important feature of the search result, because a small aircraft crashing into water leaves evidence, aviation fuel, oil, fabric, foam from cushions, personal belongings, that distributes across the surface within hours of impact. Bass Strait in late October is not so cold or so rough that surface evidence would be rapidly dispersed. The search found nothing. The most conservative explanation is that Valentich became spatially disoriented, that what he described was his own navigation lights reflected in the water or another misidentification produced by disorientation, that he entered an uncontrolled spiral dive, and that the Cessna hit the water in a steep enough angle and at high enough speed to sink rapidly without leaving significant surface debris. This explanation is physically possible. Steep high-speed impacts can produce rapid sinking with limited surface debris under specific conditions. The disorientation explanation for what Valentich described, the lights, the metallic object, the orbiting, is consistent with the visual experiences reported by pilots in the early stages of spatial disorientation, in which external lights can appear to move, multiply, and exhibit behaviors inconsistent with their actual physical properties. But the disorientation explanation requires that Valentich maintained 6 minutes of calm, detailed, technically specific radio communication while simultaneously being so severely disoriented that he could not control his aircraft. Spatial disorientation in pilots typically produces stress responses that are audible in radio transmissions: increased heart rate, shortened breath, loss of the smooth cadence of professional communication. Valentich's transmission shows none of these stress signatures. He sounds, throughout the 6 minutes, like a pilot reporting an unusual observation rather than a pilot losing control of his aircraft. The 17 seconds of metallic sound at the end of the transmission are not consistent with the acoustic signature of an aircraft hitting water, which produces a different and more recognizable sound pattern. What produced those 17 seconds has been analyzed by acoustic engineers without reaching a consensus interpretation. No wreckage from Valentich's aircraft has ever been found, despite subsequent sonar surveys of Bass Strait in the relevant area. An engine cowl flap that washed up on Flinders Island in 1983 was assessed by Australian transport authorities as possibly consistent with a Cessna 182 but not definitively identifiable as Valentich's aircraft. The specific outcome of the investigation was an open finding. The cause and circumstances of the disappearance could not be determined. Frederick Valentich remains officially listed as missing. The recording of his radio transmission is publicly available. The 17 seconds of metallic sound at the end are real. What happened over Bass Strait between 7:06 and 7:12 p.m. on October 21, 1978 has not been established. The transcript is available, the recording is available, the silence at the end of the recording is available, and the specific gap between a calm, technically accurate 6-minute radio narration and the complete absence of any physical evidence of a crash in the area where the narration ended is the feature that keeps the Valentich case in a genuinely different category from the straightforward aircraft accident it would otherwise be. Whatever explanation eventually accounts for the 17 seconds of metallic sound and the silence that followed it will need to account for both the narration and the absence. No explanation, so far, has done both. Valentich described something in real time that he could not identify and then went silent. The next mystery involves a document whose entire content cannot be read, not because the language was lost, but because the language has never been identified. It has been waiting in a library in New Haven for more than a century, and the most accomplished codebreakers in history have not been able to open it. In 1912, in the library of the Jesuit College at the Villa Mondragone in Frascati, Italy, a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich purchased a collection of manuscripts. One of them was unusual enough to stop him. It was a handwritten book of approximately 240 pages, written on vellum, illustrated throughout with detailed drawings of plants, astronomical diagrams, sequences of nude women in pools connected by elaborate pipe systems, and cosmological charts of uncertain purpose. The text accompanying and surrounding these illustrations was written in a script Voynich had never seen and could not identify. Carbon dating conducted in 2009 established that the vellum dated to the early 15th century, between approximately 1404 and 1438 CE. The ink has been provisionally dated to the same period. The manuscript is old, it is real. And after more than a century of intensive study by some of the most formidable analytical minds in the world, not a single word of it has been definitively read. The manuscript's history before Voynich is partially recoverable. The earliest documented owner is Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire, who ruled from 1576 to 1612 and maintained his court at Prague, one of the centers of Hermetic, alchemical, and Neoplatonic learning in late Renaissance Europe. Rudolf collected unusual books and scientific objects with an intensity that made his court a destination for scholars, magicians, and charlatans from across the continent. He reportedly paid 600 gold ducats for the Voynich manuscript, an extraordinary sum equivalent to the annual salary of a senior court official. Someone sold it to him by representing it as something of great value, in an intellectual environment where books of secret knowledge were among the most coveted objects a collector could possess. After Rudolf's death, the manuscript passed through several hands in the Prague scholarly community before being donated sometime in the early 17th century to the Jesuit College at the Mondragone, where it sat untouched in the library for approximately 250 years until Voynich found it. At every stage of this chain of custody, Rudolf's court, the subsequent owners, the Jesuit library, presumably educated people attempted to read it and failed. The manuscript has been failing to be read by intelligent, motivated people for at least 400 years. Since Voynich's discovery, the range and quality of people who have attempted to decipher the text is remarkable. William Friedman, the American cryptanalyst who broke the Japanese purple cipher during the Second World War and is widely considered the greatest cryptanalyst of the 20th century, spent years on the Voynich manuscript and did not crack it. The teams that developed the theoretical foundations of modern cryptography and information theory applied their methods to the text without producing a reading. Computational linguists have run every statistical analysis available across decades of improving computational power without arriving at a confirmed decipherment. What the statistical analyses have established is that the text is not random. It has the internal structure of natural language, specific patterns of letter combination, specific word length distributions, specific repetition patterns that are extremely difficult to produce in a fabricated text without either writing a real language or building an elaborate rule-based pseudo-language with genuine linguistic properties. The text has been analyzed using information-theoretic methods that can distinguish natural language from ciphertext from random noise, and it consistently reads as natural language rather than as either of the other categories. This is consistent with the text being a genuine language written in an original script. It is also consistent with a synthetic language, an invented language with genuine linguistic properties, constructed by someone with sophisticated knowledge of how natural languages work statistically. The illustrations add complexity to every proposed interpretation. The plant section depicts botanical forms that do not correspond cleanly to any identified species. Some resemblances to real plants have been noted by botanists, but none is precise enough for confident identification. If the plants are imaginary, the manuscript is not a botanical reference. If they are real plants rendered inaccurately or symbolically, the manuscript may be a genuine herbal or pharmaceutical text whose plant identifications would be recoverable by a reader who knew both the script and the specific visual conventions used. The astronomical section contains circular diagrams with figures arranged around them that resemble conventional medieval astrological illustration, but diverge from it in specific ways that suggest either a different astrological tradition or a non-astrological use of similar visual forms. The bathing women appear throughout one section in configurations that have resisted every proposed interpretation. Ritual bathing, anatomical illustration, a cosmological diagram, without any reading achieving consensus. Several proposed decipherments have been published and achieved brief media attention before being rejected by the broader research community. The rejections have been for consistent reasons. The proposed reading does not work uniformly across the text, or it requires selective interpretation of ambiguous symbols, or it produces text that is not coherent in the proposed language. No proposed decipherment has produced content that reads as meaningful, internally consistent text in any known language in a way that has withstood independent scrutiny. The Voynich manuscript remains unread. Its vellum pages are in the Binecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. High-resolution digital images are publicly available. The text is accessible to anyone with the knowledge to read it, and that knowledge, after 600 years, does not appear to exist. The Voynich manuscript holds its meaning in a script that has defeated every reader. The next mystery holds its anomaly in the shape of human bone, physical evidence that can be measured with calipers, photographed, carbon-dated, and genetically analyzed, and that still resists complete explanation. It comes from the desert coast of Peru, from graves that were sealed before the Spanish arrived. In 1928, the Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Tello led excavations at a cemetery complex on the Paracas Peninsula on Peru's southern coast, uncovering a burial tradition of extraordinary preservation and extraordinary strangeness. The Paracas culture, which flourished from approximately 800 BCE to 100 CE, was known before Tello's discoveries primarily through its textile tradition. Woven burial mantles of exceptional technical complexity, now recognized as among the finest textile work produced anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. What Tello found in the graves, preserved by the extreme aridity of the Peruvian coastal desert, was the human material that accompanied those textiles. Mummified individuals, some carefully wrapped in elaborate fiber bundles, some accompanied by ceramic vessels, tools, and food offerings, and many of them, particularly among the highest status burials, with skulls that were dramatically, abnormally elongated. Cranial modification, the deliberate reshaping of the skull during infancy, when the cranial bones are still unfused and highly plastic, was practiced widely across the ancient Americas and in other parts of the world. By applying pressure to an infant's head through binding boards, cloth wrappings, or cradle boards, the developing skull can be shaped to produce specific profiles, elongated backward, flattened frontally, broadened laterally. The practice was culturally significant across many Andean societies, encoding social identity, status, or group affiliation in the permanent visible architecture of the head. The Paracas culture practiced cranial modification, and the elongated skulls in Tello's excavations were initially classified within this tradition, but classification within the cranial modification tradition did not resolve all the questions the skulls raised. The specific constraint of deliberate head binding is this: it changes the shape of the skull but not its volume. An infant's skull is plastic, and external pressure redirects growth rather than stimulating additional growth. The total cranial volume, determined by the growing brain that the skull contains, is not increased by binding. A bound skull produces the same volume of cranial space in an elongated shape rather than the typical rounded shape. This is well established in the physical anthropology of cranial modification across all cultures that practiced it. Multiple independent measurements of Paracas skulls have found that a significant portion of them, particularly those from the highest status burial contexts, have cranial volumes approximately 25% larger than the expected range for normal human adult skulls. Not 25% larger than a typical modern skull, which might reflect population variation. 25% larger than the upper range of human cranial volume across the full span of recorded human populations. This excess volume cannot be produced by head binding. Head binding produces shape change, not volume increase. A skull 25% larger in volume than the human range contains either a brain 25% larger than typical human brains or a different cranial bone structure that altered the growth dynamics of the skull during development. The most frequently proposed anatomical explanation is a single parietal plate. In normal human skulls, the posterior cranial vault is formed by two parietal bones that meet at a suture running from front to back across the crown of the skull. In some individuals, these two bones fail to separate during development and remain fused as a single parietal plate. This variant, which occurs rarely in typical human populations, alters the growth dynamics of the developing skull in ways that can produce both an elongated shape and an increased overall volume, because the normal constraint imposed by the two-bone suture on lateral growth is absent when the bones are fused. If a population showed a high prevalence of the single parietal trait, whether through genetic inheritance, selection, or some other mechanism, the elevated frequency of very large elongated skulls within that population would be explained. DNA analysis of the Paracas skulls would directly address the question of whether the specimens with the largest and most unusual skulls form a genetically distinct population or represent the tail of normal human variation affected by cultural modification. In 2013 and 2014, researcher Brian Forster arranged DNA extraction from several specimens and submitted samples to a laboratory for analysis. The results, which were reported publicly but have not been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, were described as showing mitochondrial haplogroups inconsistent with known Native American, European, or Asian population lineages. These claims have been widely circulated in popular accounts of the Paracas skulls but have not been independently verified. The specific laboratory methods, quality controls, and raw data that would allow the claims to be evaluated scientifically have not been made public in a form sufficient for peer review. What is established beyond dispute is the physical morphology. The skulls with the largest cranial volumes are measurably outside the normal human range, and that excess cannot be attributed to head binding. Whether a genetic explanation, a developmental pathology, a population-level anatomical variant, or something else accounts for this specific anomaly is a question that requires properly conducted, peer-reviewed, ancient DNA analysis of a statistically adequate sample from the Paracas cemetery context. That analysis has not yet been published. The skulls sit in the Regional Museum of Ica in Peru, their elongated profiles visible to visitors, their specific biology waiting for the scientific attention that the question genuinely warrants. What is certain is that whoever these individuals were, the high-status men and women of the Paracas culture, wrapped in extraordinary textiles and placed in a desert that preserved them perfectly for 2,000 years, they were physically different from typical modern humans in a way that the standard categories of physical anthropology have not fully accounted for. That specific physical difference, measured in millimeters and in cubic centimeters of cranial volume, is the concrete, material fact at the center of the mystery. Everything else about the Paracas skulls is contested. That is not. The Paracas skulls are physical objects whose anomaly is measurable in millimeters. The next mystery lives in water so dark and so deep that direct observation has been possible only a handful of times in brief windows of access, producing data that has not been sufficient to close the question that the data raises. The lock has been there for 10,000 years. The question has been there for less than 100. It is not going away. Loch Ness is a freshwater lake in the Scottish Highlands, running for approximately 24 miles along the Great Glen Fault in a direction roughly northeast to southwest, approximately 1 mile wide at its widest point, and at its deepest reaching approximately 755 feet, deeper than the North Sea. The volume of water it contains is greater than the combined volume of all freshwater lakes in England and Wales combined. Its water is heavily stained by peat, washed in from the surrounding moorland, reducing visibility to near zero within a few meters of the surface, even on the clearest days. It does not freeze in winter. Its temperature at depth is a near constant 5 to 6 degrees Celsius throughout the year. The question of whether an unknown large animal inhabits Loch Ness entered the modern record in May 1933 when the Inverness Courier published an account by a local couple, John and Aldi Mackay, who reported seeing a large creature disturbing the surface of the loch. The article triggered a wave of additional sightings reported to the newspaper over the following months, and the story spread internationally. The subsequent history of the Loch Ness Monster, the iconic 1934 photograph that was eventually identified as a hoax, the succession of expeditions, the sonar surveys, the celebrity encounters, is one of the most thoroughly documented episodes of popular anomaly investigation in the 20th century, and it has produced a data set that is simultaneously extremely large and extremely difficult to interpret because of the near impossibility of separating genuine anomalous observations from expectation-driven reporting in a cultural context where the loch's reputation has been known to almost every visitor since 1933. What is worth extracting from that complicated dataset and examining carefully are the observations that come from sources with specific qualifications, specific instruments, and specific professional obligations to accuracy. The 1987 Operation DeepScan survey is the most significant of these. 20 boats with calibrated echo sounder equipment were deployed in a coordinated line across the loch, moving in parallel from one end to the other, creating a continuous sonar sweep of the water column across the full width and length of the loch. The survey was organized by Adrian Shine, a naturalist who had been conducting systematic scientific investigations of the loch since the 1970s, and who approached the question with genuine methodological rigor. The sweep produced 3 anomalous contacts. Sonar returns at depths greater than the known fish population of the loch, with sizes suggesting objects larger than any fish species documented in the loch's fauna. Shine stated at the time that the contacts were either large, animate objects or were produced by acoustic phenomena in the loch that the equipment could not characterize. He did not claim the contacts were a monster. He accurately described what the data showed and what it did not show. In 2018, an environmental DNA survey was conducted by a team led by Professor Neil Gemmell of the University of Otago in New Zealand in collaboration with several other institutions. Environmental DNA, genetic material shed by organisms into the water through skin cells, feces, mucus, and other biological material, was sampled at multiple depths and locations throughout the loch. The genetic signatures recovered were analyzed against databases of known species. The results confirmed the presence of a large number of species already known to inhabit the loch and found no evidence of large reptiles, sharks, or other charismatic megafauna not previously known to be present. Notably, the survey found unusually high concentrations of eel DNA, consistent with a large population of European eels inhabiting the loch, a finding that Gemmell noted was interesting without being definitive, since eels are common in Scottish lochs, and the elevated concentration might reflect sampling bias or local population density rather than anything anomalous about the Loch Ness eel population. What the eDNA survey did not do, and its authors were careful to note that it did not do, was establish the complete biological inventory of the loch. Environmental DNA sampling has known limitations in cold, deep, dark, peat-stained water. The peat chemistry can degrade DNA rapidly, and the circulation patterns of deep water may mean that genetic material from deep water organisms is not well represented in surface or midwater samples. The absence of a genetic signature in the eDNA survey is not evidence that the organism is absent. It is evidence that the organism, if present, did not shed detectable genetic material into the samples taken at the specific times and locations sampled. For a rare, possibly deep-dwelling, possibly solitary organism, this is a weak negative result. What the full Loch Ness dataset produces, when examined honestly, is a lake that has not been fully searched, whose biological inventory is not completely known, whose deep waters have been visited by human beings only a handful of times, and which has produced anomalous sonar contacts on multiple occasions from credible sources using calibrated equipment. None of this confirms the existence of a large unknown animal. It confirms that the question has not been definitively closed, by the investigations conducted so far, and that the specific environmental characteristics of the loch, its depth, its zero visibility, its volume, make it a genuinely difficult place to search comprehensively. The answer to the question of what lives in Loch Ness may be prosaic. What it is not, despite decades of investigation, is certain. From a lake too deep and dark to search conclusively, we move to a stretch of high desert in West Texas where the mystery is not in the dark, but in the light, a light that has been appearing since before the roads existed, observed by every generation that has lived in the area and not yet fully explained. The Mitchell Flat is a broad expanse of high desert east of the town of Marfa in Presidio County, Texas, at an elevation of approximately 1,500 meters above sea level. The terrain is flat, dry and sparse, short grasses, scattered shrubs, the Chinati Mountains visible to the south. On clear nights, which are frequent in this part of the Chihuahuan Desert, the sky is extraordinarily dark, and the horizon in most directions is the horizon of the land rather than the horizon of a city's glow. It is a landscape that reveals things. And on many nights, not every night, but often enough to have attracted sustained attention for a century and a half, it reveals lights. The Marfa lights appear as glowing orbs above the desert plain east of Marfa, typically in the direction of the Chinati Mountains. They are white, yellow, orange, or red in color. They appear singly or in clusters. They hover, drift, split apart, merge, move horizontally, ascend, descend. Some displays last for minutes, some last for hours. They appear without sound, without smell, without apparent source. They have been photographed, filmed, and measured. The Texas Department of Transportation maintains an official viewing area on Highway 90 east of Marfa because the lights appear often enough and are sufficiently interesting to attract enough visitors that a designated viewing area is a practical amenity. The viewing area has informational panels. The Marfa lights have become a local institution. The earliest documented account comes from 1883, when Robert Ellison, a rancher who had recently moved into the area, reported seeing lights in the desert east of his camp that he initially assumed were Apache campfires. Investigation found no campfires. The 1883 date is crucial because it predates the existence of any roads across the Mitchell Flat by decades. The most common debunking explanation for the Marfa lights attributes them to the refracted headlights of vehicles on Highway 67, which crosses the flat between Marfa and Presidio and is visible from the viewing area on certain atmospheric conditions. This explanation is legitimate for a subset of the observed lights. Refraction of distant headlights in the temperature inversions that are common in high desert environments can produce exactly the kind of floating, splitting, merging light behavior that visitors to the viewing area describe, but it cannot account for Ellison's 1883 observation or for similar accounts from the 1890s and early 1900s that predate automobile traffic in the area. Something was producing lights in the Mitchell Flat before any vehicle crossed it. The Sul Ross State University research team that investigated the Marfa lights in the early 2000s conducted the most rigorous scientific investigation of the phenomenon to date. Their approach involved simultaneous observation from multiple positions using calibrated instruments, allowing the lights to be triangulated to specific positions in the desert and distinguished from vehicle headlights by their angular velocity relative to the road position. They identified a population of lights clearly attributable to highway traffic, and a residual population that could not be attributed to traffic, lights appearing at positions and with behaviors inconsistent with vehicles on any road in the area. For this residual population, the team proposed that piezoelectric effects in the crystalline geology of the Chinati Mountains, combined with ball lightning or related atmospheric electrical phenomena, might produce the observed lights. The Chinati Mountains are composed in part of igneous and metamorphic rocks containing significant quartz content, and the mechanical stress on these rocks produced by temperature cycling could generate the kind of piezoelectric currents that might, under specific atmospheric conditions, ionize the air sufficiently to produce luminescent phenomena. The piezoelectric hypothesis has not been experimentally confirmed. The specific mechanism by which underground rock stress generates visible atmospheric luminosity over a distance of several miles has not been worked out in physical detail sufficient to constitute a predictive model, and the Marfa lights do not appear on every night of high-temperature cycling or on any other schedule that correlates cleanly with the proposed triggering mechanism. The Sol-Ross investigation is the most scientifically sophisticated work done on the question, and it produced a plausible but unconfirmed hypothesis for the non-traffic lights. The lights that cannot be explained by traffic, the ones that appear in positions and with behaviors the traffic explanation cannot account for, remain genuinely unexplained. Subsequent to the Sol-Ross investigation, more sophisticated monitoring has been conducted using higher resolution cameras and GPS-coordinated position logging. Some of these investigations have produced more detailed characterization of the non-traffic lights, their specific temperature signatures, their specific movement profiles, their specific frequency of occurrence under different atmospheric conditions. The picture that emerges is consistent with a natural phenomenon of some kind related to the atmospheric and geological conditions of the high desert environment, but inconsistent with any single proposed mechanism accounting for all the observed behavior across all documented events. The Marfa lights are probably natural. What specific natural process or combination of processes produces them is a question that a century and a half of observation and several decades of scientific investigation have not fully answered. They continue to appear over the Mitchell Flat on their own schedule, indifferent to the debate about what they are, visible to anyone who parks at the viewing area on the right night and waits long enough. The desert is patient, the lights are patient, and the people who drive out from Marfa to watch them are still waiting, as people have been waiting since 1883 for the understanding that keeps not quite arriving. The Marfa lights appear at the surface, in the open air, under an enormous sky. The next mystery is the deepest one on Earth in the most literal sense, a set of features observed on the ocean floor at a depth where the pressure is 800 times the pressure of the atmosphere at the surface, in water that has been visited by human beings exactly 3 times in all of history. The Mariana Trench is the deepest known point on the Earth's surface, a crescent-shaped depression in the western Pacific Ocean floor, stretching for approximately 2,550 kilometers in a direction roughly parallel to the Mariana Islands. Its deepest section, the Challenger Deep, reaches approximately 10,135 meters below sea level. The trench was formed by the subduction of the Pacific Plate beneath the Mariana Plate at a convergent boundary, and it continues to be geologically active with ongoing seismic activity along the plate boundary. It is one of the least explored environments on Earth. A human being has been to the floor of the Challenger Deep exactly 3 times, the Trieste in 1960, the Deep-Sea Challenger in 2012, and a private expedition in 2019. Each visit lasted hours. The trench floor spans thousands of square kilometers. The vast majority of it has never been observed directly. The Serena Deep is one of the secondary depressions within the Mariana Trench system, not the absolute deepest point, but a nearby basin reaching approximately 10,009 meters, among the most extreme environments accessible to remotely operated vehicles. In 2016, a survey vessel operated by the Schmidt Ocean Institute, a non-profit oceanographic research organization founded by Eric and Wendy Schmidt, was conducting a systematic survey of the Mariana Trench region using a remotely operated vehicle called Sebastian. The ROV was equipped with high-definition cameras and lighting systems capable of documenting the seafloor in considerable detail. At a depth of approximately 8,043 meters in the Sirena Deep, the cameras captured something on the sediment floor that the science team found difficult to immediately classify. The features appeared to show a series of linear arrangements on the sediment surface, parallel lines and right-angled intersections covering an area of several square meters. The lines were defined by slight differences in the texture or composition of the sediment rather than by raised structures, but they were distinct enough to be visible in the high-definition footage and to read as geometric rather than random. The Schmidt Ocean Institute published the footage and described the features as requiring investigation without drawing conclusions about their origin. The science team noted that the features were inconsistent with the typical appearance of sediment disturbance by current, by biological activity of the types known from other Hadal survey sites, or by the ROV itself, which had not passed through the area before filming it. Several natural explanations have been proposed for the Sirena Deep features. The most widely discussed involves xenophyophores, giant single-celled organisms, some reaching 20 centimeters in diameter, that are among the most abundant macroorganisms in hadal environments. Xenophyophores feed by moving across the sediment surface and ingesting organic material, leaving feeding trails behind them. In some survey images from other hadal sites, xenophyophore feeding trails show enough regularity to appear somewhat geometric at small scales. The specific proposal is that the Sirena Deep features are the feeding traces of very large xenophyophores or groups of xenophyophores feeding in coordinated or overlapping patterns on the sediment floor. The difficulty with the xenophyophore explanation is the specific character of the geometry. Xenophyophore feeding trails documented at other hadal sites show the kind of irregular regularity, repeated motifs of curved lines and partial circles, characteristic of individual organisms moving through their foraging area. The Sirena Deep features show a different pattern. Longer straight lines meeting at right angles, covering a larger area with a consistency that is more reminiscent of a constructed grid than of biological foraging behavior. Whether this difference is meaningful, whether it reflects a genuinely different process, or whether it reflects the specific conditions of the Sirena Deep sediment and specific xenophyophore behavior in that environment, is exactly the kind of question that would be answerable by a follow-up survey with instruments capable of sampling and close examination. That follow-up survey has not been conducted. The Sirena Deep at 8,143 meters requires specialized deep-sea rated equipment to reach and to survey adequately. Remotely operated vehicles rated for this depth are rare and expensive to operate. The Schmidt Ocean Institute's Sebastian is rated to 4,500 meters. The 2016 footage was taken at a depth exceeding its rated capacity, which itself reflects the extraordinary conditions of the survey. A vehicle capable of sampling the Sirena Deep sediment for biological and chemical analysis would need to be purpose-built for hadal depths, requiring significant investment that has not been allocated specifically to revisiting this location. The Sirena Deep geometric features sit in an unanswered state that will remain unanswered until someone returns to that specific location with the instruments to examine the features directly. Whether the features are extraordinary or prosaic, whether they are produced by biology, by geology, by current, or by something not yet proposed, is a question that the 2016 footage raises but cannot answer. The deep ocean floor is the largest unexplored environment on Earth. The features photographed at 843 meters in the Sirena Deep are one data point in an environment where data points are extraordinarily rare and where each one carries more uncertainty than data points collected in better accessed environments. They are the deepest mystery in tonight's collection in the most literal sense, and they will remain in that category until the technology and the will to revisit them converge. At 8,143 meters below sea level, the Sirena Deep features sit beyond casual investigation. The next mystery involves an animal, or the memory of an animal, in another remote and poorly explored environment, the equatorial forests of Central Africa, where a tradition of description specific enough to constitute natural history has persisted for over a century without producing the physical evidence that would settle the question. The Congo Basin is the second largest tropical rainforest on Earth, covering approximately 3 million square kilometers of Central Africa, in a region of extraordinary biodiversity and remarkable scientific inaccessibility. The Congo River and its tributaries drain an area the size of Western Europe, flowing through terrain that ranges from dense lowland rainforest to montane cloud forest to open savanna, most of it accessible only by river or on foot. The biological richness of the region is matched by its scientific underdocumentation. Large sections of the Congo Basin have never been systematically surveyed for wildlife, and new species are formally described from the region with a regularity that reflects how much remains unknown rather than how thoroughly the region has been explored. The okapi is the most instructive precedent. This large mammal, a relative of the giraffe standing approximately 1.5 meters at the shoulder, inhabits the Ituri forest of the Democratic Republic of Congo and was unknown to Western science until 1901, when P.L. Sclater formally described it from a skin and partial skull obtained through local intermediaries. Indigenous forest peoples of the region, the Mbuti and other groups, had been living alongside the Okapi for millennia and had detailed practical knowledge of the animal's habits, habitat, and behavior. Western scientists had received reports from colonial officials and explorers describing a large forest animal called the ati, or oapi, for decades before formal description. Those reports were not taken seriously until physical specimens made denial impossible. The Okapi lesson is specific and important. Large unknown mammals can exist in the Congo forest, can be well known to indigenous peoples over generations, and can remain unknown to Western science for decades after initial reports, if the forest is dense enough and the scientific attention is limited enough. Mokele-mbembe is the name used by multiple forest-dwelling peoples of the Congo Basin, including the Bamenjelele, the Baka, and the Bangombe, for a large animal said to inhabit the deep rivers and lakes of the region. The descriptions provided by these communities to the investigators who have collected them, beginning in the early 20th century and continuing through recent decades, are consistent in their core features. A very large animal, substantially larger than a hippopotamus, with a long neck, a massive body and a long tail. The animal is described as primarily aquatic, inhabiting deep river pools and lake margins. It is described as herbivorous, feeding on the vegetation at the water's edge. It is described as dangerous if approached closely. Western investigators who showed indigenous informants pictures of various known animals reported that the descriptions most closely matched sauropod dinosaurs, the large, long-necked, long-tailed, herbivorous dinosaurs that appear in reconstructions of the Mesozoic fauna. This observation was reported and it was accurate. Whether it was correctly interpreted is the specific question on which the Mokele-mbembe investigation has repeatedly founded. The sauropod interpretation that Mokele-mbembe is a living dinosaur, a survivor of a group that went extinct 66 million years ago, is the interpretation that made the story famous and that underlies most of the popular treatment of the subject. It is also the interpretation least consistent with everything known about vertebrate biology and the fossil record. Dinosaurs did not survive the end Cretaceous extinction event, at least not in the form of non-avian dinosaurs. Birds are technically avian dinosaurs, but that is not what the Mokele-mbembe description suggests. A population of large sauropods surviving in the Congo Basin for 66 million years would have left fossil evidence detectable in geological formations across the region and would have been encountered and recorded by the many thousands of years of human habitation of the forest. Neither the fossil evidence nor the continuous historical record of indigenous peoples encountering Mokele-mbembe as an ongoing, normal feature of their environment supports a dinosaur interpretation. The indigenous communities do not describe Mokele-mbembe as a miraculous survival from another era. They describe it as an animal, a large, dangerous, aquatic animal that lives in the deep rivers and that they know from practical experience how to avoid. What the indigenous communities are actually describing, the specific animal whose characteristics have been communicated to outside investigators across a century of contact, is the more interesting question. Several candidates among known large animals have been proposed, exceptionally large Nile crocodiles, which can reach lengths of 6 meters and inhabit the rivers of the Congo Basin, hippopotami in unusual postures or contexts, large aquatic monitor lizards of undescribed species. None of these candidates accounts for the full specificity of the indigenous descriptions, particularly the long neck, which is the most consistently reported feature and the least consistent with any known aquatic species in the region. A large unknown species of aquatic mammal or reptile, not a dinosaur but something that has not been formally described by science, remains the most parsimonious explanation for the consistent specific features of the descriptions in a region where the precedent of the Okapi establishes that large, unknown mammals can persist undescribed until systematic investigation is conducted. That systematic investigation has not been conducted for Mokele-mbembe. The expeditions that have traveled to the Likuala swamps of the Republic of Congo or to Lake Tele, the specific locations most frequently associated with the animal, have been organized by enthusiasts, not by the systematic wildlife survey programs that produce definitive biological inventories. The specific scientific work required, systematic eDNA sampling of the deep river pools and lake systems in the most frequently cited locations, has not been funded or conducted. Until it is, Mokele-mbembe occupies the same position as every other biological entity described by credible local observers in an under-surveyed environment. Possible, plausible, given the precedent of the okapi, and unconfirmed by the specific physical evidence that scientific biology requires before a new species is accepted. Mokele-mbembe inhabits, if it inhabits anything, some of the most remote river systems on Earth. Flight 19 disappeared over some of the most heavily trafficked ocean in the Americas. The contrast between those two environments, one so remote that a large animal could plausibly remain undescribed, the other so busy that a military disappearance triggered one of the largest searches in American naval history, makes it stranger, not less strange, that what happened to the 5 aircraft and their 14 crew members has never been found. On December 5, 1945, at 2:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 United States Navy Avenger torpedo bombers departed Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in Florida on a routine training exercise designated Flight 19. The 5 aircraft were TBM Avengers, large, heavy, reliable naval patrol bombers that the Navy had operated for several years and that were mechanically well understood. The 14 men aboard, pilots and crew, were a mix of experienced instructors and student aviators, with the flight led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot with 2,500 hours of flying time. The exercise called for a straightforward route: fly east over the ocean to a practice bombing range at Chicken Shoals near Bimini, then continue further east and north before turning west and southwest to return to Fort Lauderdale. The round trip was expected to take approximately 2 hours. The first sign of difficulty came at 3:40 p.m. when Taylor made radio contact with the Fort Lauderdale Tower and reported that his compasses were malfunctioning and that he was not sure of his position. He said that he believed he was somewhere in the Florida Keys, south of Florida rather than east of it, and that he could not determine which way was west. This disorientation about position was the beginning of a navigation failure that would prove fatal. The Keys' identification was almost certainly incorrect. Taylor and his flight were almost certainly east of Florida in the Bahamas, not south of Fort Lauderdale in the Keys, and the confusion about which direction was west reflected a genuine compass malfunction combined with a mistaken initial position fix. As the flight attempted to navigate home based on Taylor's incorrect assessment of their position, they flew northeast in the direction that would take them to the open Atlantic, rather than northwest, which would have taken them back over Florida. Radio contact was maintained for several hours, though its quality degraded as the aircraft moved farther from Fort Lauderdale. Transcripts of the available communications show Taylor increasingly uncertain about position, proposing headings that the other pilots questioned, and eventually losing the coherent picture of the flight situation that would have allowed effective navigation decisions. At 5:50 p.m., Taylor transmitted that his aircraft's fuel was running low, and that when the first plane dropped below 10 gallons, he would go down together with the flight. After that, radio contact became intermittent and then was lost entirely. The last confirmed position of Flight 19 was somewhere in the northeastern Bahamas or the southwestern Atlantic, based on the known heading and airspeed over the period of documented communication. A Martin PBM Mariner flying boat, with 13 men aboard, that was launched from Banana River Naval Air Station to search for Flight 19. The Mariner disappeared within 20 minutes of launch. It was seen to explode in flight by the crew of a surface vessel in the area. An investigation found that the Martin Mariner was known to have fuel leak issues that could lead to dangerous fuel vapor accumulation in the hull, and that an explosion caused by ignition of accumulated fuel vapor was the most probable cause of the loss. The Mariner's fate, unlike Flight 19's, is established. It exploded. The 13 men aboard are among the casualties of the search rather than of the original disappearance. For Flight 19, the most plausible reconstruction of events has the 5 Avengers flying northeast until their fuel was exhausted, then ditching in the open Atlantic somewhere in the area of 30 degrees north latitude, 80 degrees west longitude, the deep Atlantic east of the Bahamas, in water of several thousand feet depth. At this depth and location, an aircraft wreck from 1945 would be essentially unrecoverable by the search technology available in 1945 or for many years thereafter. Subsequent searches of the shallow Bahamas waters, where the aircraft would have been if Taylor's Key's assessment had been correct, have found numerous aircraft wrecks from the Second World War era, but not the 5 Avengers. The specific absence of wreckage in the searched shallow areas is consistent with the open Atlantic hypothesis, in which the aircraft went down where the water depth makes recovery unlikely even with modern technology. No wreckage from Flight 19 has been confirmed in any search of any area. The Bermuda Triangle framework within which Flight 19 is usually discussed is largely a media construction whose anomalous character substantially dissolves under statistical scrutiny. The apparent concentration of disappearances attributed to the triangle reflects the concentration of traffic through a heavily traveled ocean region combined with selective reporting. Cases attributed to the triangle when losses were unexplained and cases removed from the count when ordinary explanations were found. Lawrence David Cush's 1975 systematic review of the cases found that most alleged Bermuda Triangle disappearances involved ships lost in storms, ships lost outside the triangle's boundaries, ships whose losses were exaggerated or fabricated, and ships whose fates were well established but represented as mysterious. Lloyd's of London does not charge higher insurance premiums for the area. The US Coast Guard does not maintain special procedures for it. The triangle as a zone of anomalous danger does not survive careful statistical examination. Flight 19 does survive careful examination. 14 experienced naval aviators in 5 well-maintained aircraft disappeared on a clear afternoon in an area of ocean that was searched extensively within hours of the loss. No wreckage has been confirmed, despite successive searches over 8 decades. The specific sequence of navigation errors that led to the loss is understandable and has been reconstructed in detail, but the physical absence of the aircraft and their crews, the specific completeness of the disappearance, places Flight 19 in a category distinct from the fabricated or exaggerated cases that make up most of the Bermuda Triangle mythology. It happened. The aircraft and the men are somewhere in the Atlantic. The specific location has not been found. There is a specific feeling that comes with sitting in the dark and thinking about things that have not been explained. Not the comfortable darkness of settled knowledge where the questions have answers and the answers have been checked and the checking is done, but the particular darkness of a question that has been held up to every available light and has not yielded, that has been examined by serious people with serious tools and has remained, after all of it, genuinely open. That is the darkness that tonight's mysteries live in. And it is worth saying clearly before we rest what that darkness actually is. It is not the darkness of ignorance, the simple condition of not having looked. Every mystery we have visited tonight has been looked at. Some of them have been looked at for centuries, some have been measured, photographed, carbon dated, DNA analyzed, radar scanned, sonar swept, and subjected to every instrument that the relevant science could bring to bear. The darkness that remains is not the darkness before the looking. It is the darkness that the looking found. This is a specific and important distinction. The genuine unknown is not the same as the unstudied. The genuine unknown is what is left after the studying. The residue that careful, sustained, honest investigation has not been able to resolve. It is harder to sit with than simple ignorance because it cannot be dismissed as a failure of attention. It requires the specific intellectual patience of acknowledging that the evidence is real, the investigation has been serious, and the question is still open. Human beings are not naturally comfortable with open questions. We are a pattern-seeking species built by evolution to find explanations, to close loops, to convert uncertainty into the kind of working knowledge that allows action. The open question resists this. It stays open. It does not close on demand, and it does not respond to the pressure of wanting it to be resolved. The mysteries that have been with us for decades or centuries are the ones that have resisted exactly this pressure from exactly the people most motivated to resolve them. What the genuine unknown asks of us then is not cleverness or persistence or better instruments, though all of those help. It asks first, and most fundamentally, for honesty. The honesty to acknowledge what the evidence shows and what it does not show. The honesty to hold a conclusion as provisional when the evidence is insufficient to make it final. The honesty to say, in the face of a question that has been studied seriously and has remained open, that it is genuinely open, not because no one has looked, but because the looking has not yet been enough. That honesty is not a failure. It is the most accurate possible description of where human knowledge actually stands at any given moment in history. A vast accumulated understanding surrounded on all sides by questions it has not yet answered. The circle of the known is real, and it is large, and it has a perimeter, and the perimeter is alive with questions. That perimeter is where tonight's mysteries live. Real questions at the edge of real knowledge, held open by the specific weight of evidence that has not resolved them. They will not all be answered in our lifetimes. Some may not be answered at all, but they will continue to be asked by everyone who finds them and takes them seriously, because that is what honest questions do. They persist, they wait, they are patient in a way that only things that are genuinely important can be. Now let them wait in the dark while you sleep. They will be there in the morning, exactly as open as they were tonight. That is all right. Some things are worth carrying gently. Sleep well.